Alrighty, thank you, Tim Berg, for joining me once again. So, what I am wanting to talk about today, this is something that actually was not originally on our radar, and then you brought it up on social media, and I realized that I've been thinking about it a lot, and you've been studying it apparently a lot recently, it sounds like. And I've been thinking about it and had some questions about it, and so I figured it would be a nice addition to our kind of series that it seems that we've ended up creating on Baptist history and heritage and things like that. Specifically, what I want to talk about is in the realm of Baptist distinctives, or what makes a Baptist. And so this is a question that we hear all these different things, and everybody might have something different in their mind. A lot of people are familiar with, like, say, the Baptist Acronym or things like that. But I've had some questions about it for a little while now. Just some things that we'll dive into a little bit as we go. But as far as whether it's the consistency of those different standards, how they apply overall, and how distinct they really are, or as far as like how unique they are to Baptists, and then I noticed that you started bringing some of those points up online. So I want to dive into that and ask you some questions along the way, because I see that you've been doing a lot of reading and writing on this lately. So I figured this would make a really fun and educational conversation for me and anybody else that listens.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's worth talking about too. I mean, we had talked before about doing an interview on sort of Baptist history and Baptist origins, but then when you mentioned the idea of doing something specific on this, or maybe I mentioned, I don't remember, it makes sense to talk first about sort of Baptist identity. What makes someone a Baptist? If we're going to talk about when did Baptists start and what is the Baptist history and heritage, I mean, you have to really be able to answer the question first, what is a Baptist, right? Like that's sort of a prerequisite question before you get to some of those other questions. So I think it'd be great to have a whole discussion about Baptist identity and Baptist distinctives.
Yeah, I completely agree. We had originally said that the next time I had you on would be to talk about Baptist history in the sense of where did Baptists come from and who are they, their origin, things like that.
Yeah.
But this does naturally lend itself to being kind of a prolegomena to that, because in order to even talk about Baptist history, you have to be able to identify what a Baptist is, to be able to then go back through history and identify who the Baptists were and where they came from and things like that. Because otherwise, if you don't know how to properly define a Baptist or any other denominational distinction for that matter, then you kind of just end up picking and choosing things throughout history. And we'll see some of that. That's a whole nother conversation that we'll deal with next time. But for this, I think this is very, very important kind of prerequisite for prolegomena type of conversation before we can really get into that. So why don't we just start it out with talking about what makes someone Baptist? What are some of the positions and views that there are on this? Some people may only be familiar with the acronym. What are some of the various positions that there are on defining a Baptist? And we can kind of break some of those down and what maybe some of the pros and cons of them might be.
Yeah, excellent. I mean, I think as we think about what makes a Baptist, one of the things we always want to do, and I didn't used to think this way until about a decade ago, but now whenever I'm doing theology, I always want to kind of step back when I'm looking at distinctives in my particular tradition, in this case in the Baptist tradition. I always want to step back and frame that first within sort of the broader global Catholic Church. And I use the word Catholic in kind of the small c sense. I think we talked about that before in a prior interview, the idea of Catholicity meaning the one holy universal church. So let me just real briefly kind of frame what we're going to say about Baptist and Baptist theology in light of that bigger picture. We won't spend a lot of time on it, but I think it needs to be said. So when I think of Baptist identity, just as sort of a preliminary thought, or really you called this a prolegomena. So here's a prolegomena to the prolegomena. Here's some opening thoughts just before we get into what will be opening thoughts for a later conversation. In the early Christian creed, the Nicene Creed, hints of it in the Apostles' Creed, we have what are sometimes known as the four marks of the church, that the church is one, holy, Catholic, and apostolic. And for really all the rest of church history, those have been kind of defining marks to understand what we mean when we think of the church. But as the Protestant Reformation came about in the 16th century and then continued into the 17th and on, the reformers started to realize that, at least the way they interpreted those marks, those were primarily about the universal church. Whereas they wanted to define more carefully how do you say what is and isn't a particular local church? When do you and when don't you have a genuine, pure local church? So Luther initially came up with two marks of the church. And then the Reformed, under Calvin in Switzerland, they added a third to it, sometimes called the Protestant marks of the church. And those marks where you have to have a right preaching of the gospel, a right practice of the ordinances, and then the Reformed added the idea of church discipline. Geneva was really well known, especially under Calvin, for its tight discipline. And they would argue you don't really have a church unless discipline is being exercised. So in terms of like the broader Christian ecclesiological picture, as we think of what a church is, before we zoom in on what we mean by a Baptist church and what is a Baptist, we should think in terms of that broader picture, that universal local church distinction and those marks of a church. But having laid that framework, I think we can get more specific and say, well, what then do we mean by Baptist? When we do zoom in, given that bigger picture, what do we mean by a Baptist? I'd suggest that there's at least 4 different ways that we use the word. You could probably add to this list and make many more, but there's at least 4 that are really common. Sometimes people use the word Baptist to refer to really anyone who holds to religious liberty. And I'll talk about that view a little bit more here in just a second. Sometimes people use the word Baptist to refer to essentially anyone who calls themselves a Baptist. If you say, I'm a Baptist church, or I'm a part of a Baptist church, or maybe I don't go to a Baptist church, but I am a Baptist, anyone who uses the name is a Baptist. Third, and this one's really common, sometimes we use the word Baptist just to mean anyone who baptizes believers by immersion. You may be in an entirely different denominational structure. You may be an Assemblies of God, Pentecostal, and various other charismatic denominations. You may even be like in a Churches of Christ denomination. But if someone asks you, well, what's your view of baptism? Or why didn't you baptize your baby, now that it's a year old? And you say, oh, well, I'm a Baptist. And you don't mean that I'm denominationally connected to Baptists. You just mean I hold to believers' baptism by immersion. I think all 3 of those uses have some validity to them. Like we use the word Baptist in those sort of looser ways, and sometimes that's okay. Like I'm not out to argue against those uses of the word Baptist. But I think this 4th one is really sort of the technical definition of what do you mean by a Baptist? And that's more specifically someone who confesses the Baptist distinctives, not just in these looser senses, holds to religious liberty or uses the name Baptist or baptizes by immersion, but specifically holds to Baptist theology. So what I'm doing there, I'm sketching out one view of Baptist identity, but I do want to make at least a brief footnote. There are 2 main ways that theologians and historians have sketched out Baptist identity. The first one is these are Tom Nettles' terms. The first one is sometimes called coherent truth. Tom Nettles, Stanton Norman, Timothy George, loads and loads of others. They argue that you're a Baptist by virtue of certain specific theological content that you have and that you hold to, that you confess and profess and live by. There is a second view that was really pioneered by E.Y. Mullins. Mullins was the president of the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary, where I'm actually a student there. And I think we might have mentioned Mullins before when we talked about the 19th century fundamentalist modernist controversy. Mullins was a really fascinating character. In one sense, he was a card-carrying fundamentalist. I didn't bring him out here, but I think last time we held up the 4-volume set of the Fundamentals, Mullins contributed to that set. He's got one of the articles in there on religious experience. So he sort of checked all the boxes to be a fundamentalist, but he was also what's called a mediating theologian who was trying to kind of build bridges between fundamentalism and liberalism. And so he wasn't a separatist like most of the other fundamentalists were. And I think we talked last time about how original fundamentalism really wasn't all that separatist in its origins. It was later that it became increasingly separatistic. Well, Mullins wasn't very separatistic at all. And he sought to build much bigger connections with broader Christianity. And he conceived of the core of Baptist identity as being related to religious experience, not particular views that you might have about the Bible and baptism in the church, but really just a commitment to the sort of broad Baptist principle of religious freedom. He was followed by a number of later theologians who conceived Baptist identity that way. 2 that I'll mention here. Walter, I never know how to say his name, Rauschenbusch, I think, the father of the social gospel, the idea that we don't really necessarily need to teach particular content about Jesus on the cross to change the world, as long as we're helping people physically that are poor, that are starving, which there is a gospel imperative, I think, to social work, but he tended to redefine the gospel as equaling social work and nothing more. And then later, Harry Emerson Fosdick. Fosdick was a leader among the liberals during the fundamentalist liberal controversy. In fact, he preached a really famous sermon. I don't remember if we mentioned this last time or not, but he preached a really famous sermon called "Shall the Fundamentalist Win?" where he was arguing against the fundamentalists and saying ultimately they're a bunch of backwards hobos. They'll disappear eventually. They'll never last. And that sermon became really kind of a touch point for liberal theologians who were trying to redefine the Christian faith in a little bit more of a liberal direction. So Fosdick was a outspoken liberal. In fact, there were some Presbyterians, like mentioned, that really wanted him to become a Presbyterian because as a Baptist, he could say whatever he wanted. There was no real board that could check him. There was no denominational accountability. But they figured if they could turn him into a Presbyterian, then they could report him to his synod for being unorthodox and they could get him kicked out of ministry. He was too smart to fall for that, and so he never would do it. And so he stayed quote unquote Baptist. But they sketched out this view of Baptist identity where they were happy calling themselves Baptist, so you'd get figures like Fosdick and other later figures who were part of a quote unquote Baptist church. They called themselves Baptist, but they didn't believe in the deity of Jesus. They didn't believe in the virgin birth. They didn't believe in the inspiration of scripture. And yet they were quote unquote Baptist. So they built this idea of Baptist identity as essentially meaning just religious liberty. So anyone who holds to religious liberty is a Baptist. Well, I don't hold that view.
And by religious liberty, we mean what exactly?
Yeah, soul liberty or religious liberty. We'll talk more about this later. There's actually 5 or 6 different concepts that are all slightly distinct but related. Soul competency, soul liberty, individual soul responsibility, individual soul liberty, separation of church and state, religious freedom. What's that, like 6 different things? They're all technically slightly distinct, but we oftentimes group them together into 2 or 3 core ideas. And the idea there being with soul liberty is I have the right to form my own religious opinions. I can worship God according to the dictates of my own conscience. So in its proper sense, that idea is no state can tell me what I must believe and force me with a sword, so to speak, to believe X, Y, Z, or be killed or be persecuted or imprisoned. And this sort of view of Baptist identity as it developed, the way that it typically would come about, they'd argue it based on the priesthood of the believer, which we'll talk about in a minute why that was misguided. But they would say, well, since I'm a priest, you have no right to tell me that I have to, for example, if I'm in a denominational institution, I teach at Southern Seminary, you have no right to tell me that I have to believe in the inspiration of the Bible to teach because I'm a priest to God, right? I can believe whatever the dictates of my conscience shape. You can't tell me what to believe. That was kind of the expression that it would take. And then they would say that since that's a core Baptist principle, that's what it means to be a Baptist. You hold to that kind of liberty. You're not forcing other people to believe a particular thing, so therefore you're a Baptist. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that view because I don't hold it. I think it's completely a misshapen view of Baptist identity. And I hold to what's called that coherent truth view. That's Tom Nettles' term. I don't have it here to hold up, but Tom Nettles wrote a massive 3-volume work to basically rebut that view and argue for what he calls coherent truth. And he does it by laying out in the first volume, here's Baptist distinctives, what Baptists believe. And then for the next 3 volumes, he just teaches Baptist history, looking at individuals in Baptist profile to show, if you look back at what Baptists have always believed, they've been connected by a whole lot more than just the idea of religious liberty. There are certain core Baptist principles that they have all held to, that all Baptists have always affirmed. And you really can't be a Baptist if you don't hold to those principles. So I'm going to leave behind that second view, and for the rest of this interview, really just interact with that first idea, a coherent truth view, the idea that there is specific doctrinal content that is essential to being Baptist. I think that's completely right. There are plenty of people who disagree with me. Today, Walter Schruden's 4 Fragile Freedoms is probably the most common expression of that soul liberty view. There's good people out there who love Jesus that hold that view. I think it's fundamentally misguided. So I hold to this coherent truth view, and that's the view that I would defend.
And if somebody believes that anybody who believes in soul liberty is a Baptist, then that would be rather problematic because aren't there other groups that all? If you're Protestant, isn't that kind of an inherent piece of Protestantism? Is now depending on how, again, like you said, how you define it. If you're going to say that nobody can tell me that my theology is wrong because I answer to God alone. I think there's some, you get into some problematic waters there. But when it comes to just the, I guess, more conservative view of individual soul liberty, then doesn't that, that doesn't make you distinctly Baptist. It just would kind of be a Protestant distinctive, wouldn't it?
Yeah. We should distinguish the magisterial Protestant reformers, so Luther, Calvin, Butzer, they all held to a pretty tight church-state relationship. And so especially for instance, in Calvin's Geneva, you didn't have the right to just believe whatever you wanted. It was illegal to believe differently. And of course, in most of England's history, whether that was under the medieval Catholic setup or later under the Anglican Church, for most of that history, you had to be an Anglican. It was illegal to not be. You couldn't preach. You couldn't be licensed to preach unless you were accepted by a bishop, ordained by a bishop in the church, and in line with eventually after the Reformation, the 39 Articles. So there's not quite religious liberty in the same sense that we would use the term today, but that was through the last 400 or 500 years of its history. Today, virtually all Christians hold to some form of religious liberty. Nobody is going around today, well, certainly not at least in America, demanding that if you don't hold to their particular faith, we're going to cut your head off or we're going to throw you in prison. So yeah, you're right. That idea is really, in my mind, it is a core Baptist principle, and we'll talk about that more in a minute when I lay out sort of Baptist principles the way I think are most helpful. But it's also a principle that has spread in the modern age far and wide through the free church tradition to just loads and loads of other Protestants. Yeah, and it's problematic. You're right. To say that that's all it means to be a Baptist, I think that's really problematic.
Yeah, so at worst, the idea of soul liberty conveys something completely, actually, almost heretical, and at its best, it doesn't really distinguish you at all, and so it's kind of a useless category of, not a useless category, because we're gonna deal with that a little bit further, but it's useless as a soul distinguishing factor, to determine who is and who isn't.
Yeah, exactly. I think it's an important religious principle. I hold to it very firmly, the idea of religious liberty, not to that distortion of it that says no one can tell me what to believe. But yeah, I don't think it's certainly not sufficient to make someone a Baptist. It may be essential to being a Baptist. Like you could say, I can't be a Baptist without holding to soul liberty of some religious freedom of some kind or another. But it certainly, in my mind, is not an essential distinctive, or it's not a sufficient distinctive where anyone who believes it is a Baptist. I think it's just a misguided view. Again, good people who hold that view that I respect and love, I just disagree with them.
It's kind of like saying, anybody, you have to believe in that Jesus existed in order to be a Christian.
Right.
But not everybody who believes that Jesus existed is a Christian.
Right, exactly.
Like there's some more nuance and other things that have to come along with that.
Yeah, that's a good example. Yeah.
Okay. So it looks like you've got pulled up the Baptist acronym. Let's walk through that.
Yeah.
This is what most people are going to be like familiar with. This is what, we learned in school. This is what you learn, churches use this all the time. This is what most people are probably familiar with.
Yeah. It's become a really, really common way of setting out Baptist distinctives. And I have to say it's effective, like pedagogically. It's a very effective teaching tool. I think I probably first ran across this acronym like maybe 20 years ago. Like maybe even longer than that. It might have been more like 25 years ago. And I heard it once and instantly memorized it. Like I could still repeat it today in my sleep effectively, because it is a really helpful teaching tool in terms of laying out Baptist distinctives in a really easy to remember format. I don't know how true this is, but I found an article the other day when we were talking about it in kind of a Facebook discussion, and I went looking. An article that explained what they believe at least are kind of the origins of the acronym. They say that Dwayne Brown in the 1960s, who was teaching in a church in sort of a Sunday school format, and he was doing an 8-week series on Baptist distinctives. And one of the ladies in his class suggested, hey, what if you arrange them around these acronyms? So I guess I haven't read it, but I guess he writes in his memoir about sort of the creation of that tool. And the GARBC bulletin published a little article kind of explaining that as the source. So that's probably where it came from. It probably originated in the 1960s. To be clear, though, the idea of Baptist distinctives goes much, much further back. Let me just mention one work. I mentioned Stan Norman's name earlier. Stan has written a couple works on Baptist distinctives. This is not a book I recommend for everybody. This is a book for the nerds. But if the nerds are interested, this is not a book on Baptist distinctives. This is a book on books about Baptist distinctives. Oh, you've got it there. Yeah, you've got
do have
so
it
you're
right
a nerd
here.
of the nerds. Welcome to the Nerd Club. It's a really helpful little book. I think it was originally his master's thesis or maybe his PhD dissertation. And what it does, it traces through history, the idea that Baptists have been writing about the things that make them distinct for literally 400 years. So there are 400 years worth of writings of people laying out Baptist distinctives, identifying what they are. And then he kind of traces through that and holds to that view that I talked about before. He doesn't call it coherent truth and soul liberty. He calls it Reformed tradition and Enlightenment tradition, but kind of the same view that Nettles is the same breakdown that Nettles is taking. So Baptist distinctives, been around for hundreds of years. Roughly 400 years, people have been writing about them. This acronym, though, as a way to teach them, has really only been around probably since 1960. And it lays out some points. So I'll walk through each of them here kind of real quick. What I've done on this layout with the help of my wonderful wife, because the way I had it designed a couple hours ago did not look near as pretty, and my wife has made it look really beautiful. But what I've done is lay out the acronym, but then I've also added kind of two sets of sort of additions. In yellow, I've added yellow parentheses. I've added things that I really think need to be spelled out, that most people who use the acronym, that's what they're referring to. They just don't always say it specifically, but I think it does need to be said. If you're going to keep using the acronym, if you're going to teach with it, I think you need to spell those things out. Then I've also added in blue brackets things that you'll sometimes see people include as they spell it out that I think are questionable. So let me kind of walk through each of these real quick. The first one is biblical authority. And I think we need to spell out, you talked earlier about things that aren't really distinctive. Biblical authority is not exactly distinctive to Baptists. Literally every Christian group holds to the authority of the Bible, whether you're a Roman Catholic, whether you're Eastern Orthodox, even if you're in like one of the crazy fringe radical groups like the Quakers, who essentially don't think the Bible is necessary, they still think the Bible has some authority, right? Like they still regard, most of them at least, and there are some evangelical Quakers, but in their roots, they weren't as evangelical. But even they would say, the Bible has authority. So the idea of it being a Baptist distinctive, right off the bat, you're like, okay, maybe. I understand why they've put it at the front of this list there. And if Dwayne Brown really was the one that first put this together, I understand why he puts it at the front of the list, because there's been a long tradition in talking about Baptist distinctives as sort of seeing them all as flowing from biblical authority. We believe in the Bible, we try to follow the Bible, and that leads us to Baptist theology. I think there's some truth to that, so I can understand why it's put there, but I would want to always spell out, you're not talking about the Roman Catholic view, the Roman Catholic canon with 74 books, or the wider canon in the Orthodox Church. You really specifically, when you say that, you mean biblical authority, meaning the 66 book Protestant canon, Old Testament, New Testament, as a final authority. That's really a more Protestant view that I think is what's communicated here. So I'll run through these pretty quick, and then we'll come back when I talk about Baptist principles to kind of dig into some of them more.
Okay, so you want to go through and give an overview first, and then we can go back and
let me do kind of a quick overview of each, and then we'll come back and kind of critique them, because I have some critiques here. I kind of want to share one now, but I'll put that off for a second. Let me kind of explain each of them first. So biblical authority, autonomy of the local church. That's the idea that in a particular local congregation, no one outside that congregation tells that congregation what to do. It's not submitted to some wider body. It's not submitted to a larger ecclesiastical organization. It's not submitted to a pope or a bishop. That body is autonomous, an important principle. I'll spell that out more later. Then you have priesthood of the believers, or I've put priesthood of all believers. And I've added in yellow a really careful qualification. Sometimes it's taught as the priesthood of the believer. And in fact, a couple decades ago, there was a big hoopla in the Southern Baptist Convention and a lot of debate between those two views of Baptist identity that we talked about earlier, coherent truth and soul liberty. And those in that soul liberty wing were arguing for the priesthood of the believer and saying, well, the doctrine of the priesthood of the believer means you can't tell me what to believe. I'm my own priest to God. Well, there's a really excellent article by Timothy George that was kind of part of that debate. And I'll link it in the little list that I give you if I haven't already, that you can add in the comments. I think there's a version that you can read free online. He went through and traced the history of the doctrine of the priesthood of the believer. And he's an excellent historian, Reformation historian, wrote some incredibly important works on the Reformation, the theology of the Reformers, really widely used textbook, reading the Bible with the Reformers in the Reading the Bible series. He's working on a big collection of Baptist confessions, covenants, and catechisms that might become like the standard edition whenever it comes out, I think next year or whenever. So really highly well-respected Reformation theologian and historian. He traces out the history of the doctrine of the priesthood of the believer, and he points out that is not what Luther meant by the doctrine. Luther never meant to say, because every believer is a priest, therefore carte blanche. He's his own interpreter of the Bible. No one can tell him what to do. I mean, Luther was stringently confessional, creedal, affirmed the creeds. His beliefs were bounded by certain fences. He certainly wasn't arguing anybody can believe whatever they want. And George shows historically the phrase, the priesthood of the believer, is virtually non-existent until the rise of this sort of soul liberty view. The phrase that was used throughout history was the priesthood of all believers. So there's a corporate and communal element to the doctrine. And what the reformers actually meant by that doctrine wasn't just, well, no priest stands between me and Jesus. That element was there. But the idea really more specifically was every believer has a responsibility to be a priest for someone else. Like, I'm a part of a community and I can pray directly to Jesus without a human intermediary. And so I have a responsibility to intercede on the behalf of other believers and to watch out for their doctrine and to watch out for their orthodoxy. So George points out at the end of his article, he goes, the idea that this doctrine, the priesthood of the believers, means that doctrine's unimportant and you can believe what you want. It's virtually the exact opposite of what the doctrine meant historically. Historically, the doctrine was doctrine and orthodoxy matters, and you have a direct connection to God. So you should be helping the local body of Christ and the universal body of Christ to have right doctrine. So that it's been kind of twisted and inverted. So if you're going to use the acronym, if you're going to teach it, I think it's really important. Teach it as the priesthood of all believers, not the priesthood of the believer.
Yeah,
so that's
I had always heard it as priesthood of the believer. And then years later, I was studying it and I realized, it's like, oh, wait a second. It's not the believer, it's of all believers. And then there is a very important distinction. Some people are like, okay, what's the difference? You're just being pedantic. No.
Sure.
There's actually a fairly significant difference between that, because I think what happens is it always got conflated with individual soul liberty.
Right.
And so I was like, okay, what's the difference between these two? Because they seem to be, they would be like, oh yeah, priesthood of the believer. That means that you're a priest and you don't have to go to a priest, so you can access God on your own. And that means that you have to answer to him by yourself. And then you get down to individual soul liberty. And it was basically, they would say almost the same exact thing.
Yeah. It's like, well, if that's how you interpret it, then it's just a redundant statement. So clearly I don't think the guy that put this together, I don't think that's what he meant by it.
Yeah. And then I learned that it actually had I don't know how it ended up getting shifted at one point, if it was just an accident at first and then it kind of caught on, or what, or an intentional switch. But it was originally and should be priesthood of all believers, which is, I think, and I didn't really fully appreciate all of the distinctions between that until I had a conversation with another gentleman on this issue, who actually was not a Baptist but held firmly to this, and he was critiquing the concept of priesthood of the believer and saying that this individualistic mentality that a lot of people have about, well, I answer to God alone, and so I can do whatever I want, and you can't tell me that I'm wrong, or that, I shouldn't be living this way or doing this thing, because I answer to God, and I can believe what I want, I can do what I want. And he explained that priesthood of all believers is the priesthood element is a element of service. That
That's right.
The priests in the Bible are the ones who were in service to God in the temple and things like that. And now all of us function in that role. So we are all servants to God in the local church in various areas, but also priesthood in the sense of, like we did talk about, priesthood, that you don't have to go to a priest for them to be able to have direct communion with God. But also, a third really important element is that, like you said, as a priest, what that means is that you also are responsible for holding other people accountable in some sense. And so priesthood of all believers is not that you get to believe something so completely different from everybody else and nobody can critique that. It's actually, like you said, the opposite, where you are now responsible to hold each other accountable, and you all are on the same playing field in that sense of, like, you're not answering to a priest necessarily, but now everybody has that responsibility, both you to be held accountable by your brother and vice versa. And so that gets into, though, another element of a
polity,
covenantal congregation, and in that sense, and that which has been largely lost by a lot of Baptist churches, and that's something that our church actually is trying to really bring back and emphasize is this element of a covenantal church membership in the sense. So we have a church covenant that if somebody wants to join, then they read through it and they agree to it and they sign it, and we keep a record of them. And so, and then if somebody we've had instances where somebody wants to kind of go off in their own direction. They're like, well, you can't tell me what to do and I can do what I want and things like that. It's like, well, actually, you signed a covenant that you would be held accountable and hold each other accountable. And so this plays directly into church discipline and things like that. And so, I think this is a really important doctrine that's often misunderstood. But I'm glad you brought out the that distinction there between the two views of that, because one of them is a misrepresentation and a false idea that was not originally intended by the acronym, and then one's the original, like actual, really solid, I guess, historically based and theologically grounded view. Yeah,
good. I like that, and I couldn't agree with you more about covenant. I'll talk about that more later, actually, when I suggest kind of what I think is a better way of talking about Baptist distinctives. I completely agree. I think covenant is an essential Baptist distinctive that we've kind of gotten away from and we really need to recover. But again, let me kind of push through these and then we'll come back and offer some critique. So biblical authority, autonomy of the local church, priesthood of all believers, and then 2 ordinances. And the 2 ordinances are believers' baptism and the Lord's Supper. But I've added, again, some things that I think we need to qualify. Believers' baptism, we need to spell out what we mean is non-regenerative or non-regenerating believers' baptism. You can have practice of believers' baptism and still believe in baptismal regeneration. There's groups that do, like the Christian churches and the churches of Christ. And in fact, believers' baptism is held by the vast majority of Protestants who aren't Baptist. So I think we need to spell out non-regenerating. And then some people do add specifically believers' baptism by immersion. I'll talk about in a minute why I think that's actually a little bit questionable. Then the Lord's Supper. And again, I think we need to spell out when we say the Lord's Supper that we mean non-salvific. And some people might say that's contained in the word ordinances as opposed to sacraments. I'm fine with either word. Either word has a long history. But I think we need to spell out that when we talk about the Lord's Supper as Baptist, if you're going to use this acronym, I think you need to be careful to spell out. You mean the Lord's Supper in a non-salvific sense. It's not a saving grace. It's not a saving ordinance or sacrament.
Right. That's a whole separate discussion as to that. But I'm with you. I do not have a problem with the word sacrament. I think we should define what we mean by it. Right. And I think it has a lot of it has a very strong historical heritage in that sense.
Absolutely.
But I also think that there is an element of the Lord's Supper that is often overlooked or is actually misunderstood and leads people to actually be really, really scared of the idea of the word sacrament. But that's an entirely different conversation.
Sure. There's a lot there. And that's been honestly probably the most contentious theological issue in church history. Yeah. Certainly during the Reformation. It was the contentious issue of the Reformation among reformers, between the different reforming groups. And between reformers and Catholics, of course, transubstantiation and
our pastor just preached on this a couple of nights ago. We had a communion service, and he preached on the different views and the various elements of them, and kind of where our church would fall on the belief of the sacraments or ordinances and various views on that. And so,
where'd you land, if you don't mind my saying? What position you land at?
So
I know where I land, but I'm curious what you do.
He took to. And anybody can go and listen to this on our church's website, our church's YouTube channel, because he lays out the arguments. And I don't want to sit and lay out an entire argument here, and then also people be like, "Oh, well, you believe that, you're wrong." And go and hear the arguments at least. But the obviously not don't believe in transubstantiation, because we talked about the idea that the body and the blood are literally transformed and all this different thing. There's a lot of theological problems with that.
Yeah, I agree.
But then typically Baptists have held to the to Zwingli's position on it, which is that it's just a symbol. There's nothing more at all. And so Jesus is not present in the supper, in the elements, or anything. It's just a symbol. And we actually spent some time critiquing that and looked at various biblical passages that specifically, explicitly talk about how whenever you come together at all, anytime that believers come together or that they're taking the elements, that Christ is present in some sense. And so in Revelation, it talks about that. And Matthew, he talks about that. And so there's a critique there of saying, okay, Zwingli has also gone a little bit too far to the other side of the extreme and saying that there's no presence whatsoever. So the Catholics on one hand with transubstantiation want to say, well, it's literally Jesus. And then Zwingli on the other hand has said, well, it's literally in every possible way not. And so and so he kind of pulled that back a little bit, and I think we take a little bit more of a position that would more closely align with Calvin's position on that, I believe. If I'm not mistaken, the two Luther and Calvin's positions, because there's like a spectrum, and they kind of are a little bit closer to each other in that way. But in the sense that there is an element of grace that is given, but not in a salvific sense, as you said. There is grace that is given, and the Bible talks about how that we come before the throne of grace in order to receive grace from God. And so anybody that wants to say that all the grace you need ever is given to you at salvation, that's it, well, that's not what the Bible says. That's not how it portrays this idea. And so we're not saying salvific grace, but the idea that you can ask God for grace and he can bestow more grace to help you in your daily life and your walk with him and your community as a church, all these different things I think are present. And so that's where we kind of land more on that, a little, not quite willing to take the step as far as Zwingli did, which is probably going to catch a lot of people by surprise, because a lot of my friends and people that I know that listen to this probably take the Zwingli position on that. But I think that there's and obviously we don't have time to lay out the full case for it here, but I would encourage people to at least go in and study it, and if you want to hear the arguments for it, I can even link it in my description if I have room. We've got an extensive bibliography this time.
Yes, I kept sending you we should have this book. We should have this book. Usually I don't think about that stuff till after we meet. This time I tried to start it early. So and actually I did put in that list. I completely agree with where you're at, and it's so fascinating to me that you've landed at that place. I took a similar trajectory. In fact, in one of the later slides, I'll mention it a little bit, some of the historical basis for it. But I grew up with the Zwinglian memorial view, what Mike Berg calls the doctrine of the real absence. Jesus isn't here. That Jesus isn't here at all in any way, shape, or form, which I think, exactly as you said, I think was probably an overreaction against Roman Catholic views of transubstantiation. But the view that I hold is exactly the one you've articulated, that there is a real presence of Christ in the supper. There's not a transubstantiation of the elements, but Christ is present in a spiritual sense to those who partake by faith. I think that's an important qualification. And again, there's a big spectrum of Reformed views we could, like you said, have a long discussion about. But I also hold to the idea that there is grace in the supper, just as you said. I think that is a view with strong biblical support and strong historical support. I'll mention in a later slide among Baptists. But we do want to always carefully say, and you said so well, it's a sanctifying grace, not a saving grace.
Right.
So there's grace in the supper, but it's only a sanctifying, not a saving grace. So if you use the Baptist acronym to teach, I think you should spell some of that out a little bit. I think you need to be specific that it's a non-salvific ordinance. And then in blue, I've added, again, for precisely the reasons you just mentioned. Sometimes I see people say, well, the Lord's Supper as a memorial is the Baptist distinction. No, it's not. Many Baptists, maybe most Baptists for the first century would have disagreed with the Zwinglian memorial view. And as I also mentioned here, sometimes people will add their particular view on whether it's open, closed, or close.
Yeah.
Baptists have held all three of those positions widely throughout their history. So to me, that's a questionable conclusion. But let me kind of walk through the rest of these real quick, and then we'll come back with some critiques.
Yeah. The version of this acronym that different people have heard is probably dependent on who's teaching it. And
that's true. Yep.
Like your church's ideas of what makes a Baptist. And so you may hear like the different views of the Lord's Supper or and things like that, because they're coming from a different tradition that's like, no, this is the one. And so, that's
which
why
as a teaching tool for your own church, obviously that's fine. Here's what we teach as a church. I just think we need to be really careful if we're saying not just this is what our church believes, but this is what Baptists believe. Well, you need to be really careful what you include in that kind of a statement. There's a huge body of Christians for the last 400 years that are in that group. So you don't have the right to take your own particular little views and say anyone who doesn't hold my view is not a Baptist. So I think we should be careful about that. Let me walk through the last 3 or 4 real quick. Individual soul liberty. We've kind of already covered this and talked about what we mean by soul liberty, the idea of religious freedom. Saved church membership. The more common historical term is a regenerate church membership. The idea being in opposition to many of the magisterial reformers and in opposition to the medieval church and the church of late antiquity, where people are baptized into that church as infants. Now you have a church that's composed partly of believers and partly of unbelievers. They may be part of a broader covenant, especially in like a Presbyterian covenantal theology spectrum. They're all part of this covenant, but that's a mixed assembly of believers and unbelievers, whereas Baptists have always held firmly to a regenerate church membership or a saved church membership. I'll have a lot more to say about that later because I think it's a key Baptist distinctive. And then 2 church offices that are usually identified as pastor / elder / bishop, and then deacon. And those are the only 2, as opposed to some of the other denominations that have priest, rectors, victor, bishop, archbishop, and so on. Baptists have held the 2 church offices. And then lastly, separation of church and state, which again is that idea that flows from believers' baptism, that now we're separating the church and state so that it's not one thing where every member of the state is baptized as an infant and is automatically also a member of the church, and church and state become one thing. In Baptist theology, we're separating those 2 things, and there's a distinction, a very careful, sharp, and important distinction between them.
And by that, I want to make sure that we clarify this too, because especially today and in today's political landscape, there's a lot of misunderstanding what this concept of separation of church and state means. And what is not meant by that is that people in the church should not be involved in any sort of political or state activity. That's not at all what it's talking about. Do you want to shed a little bit of light on what it's talking about?
You've just raised a really important qualification. In fact, one of the key differences, I don't have in any of these slides planned to talk about Anabaptist, but I think when we talk about church history, we probably will talk a little bit about Anabaptist theology.
Absolutely.
Anabaptist and Baptist have a lot of overlap in their theology. Like they're remarkably similar in some ways. This is a preview for later because I don't want to spell all this out in detail. I think they're very clearly genealogically distinct groups. They're 2 totally separate genealogical paths, and they have 2 really distinct denominational and genealogical identities. But one of the key differences between Anabaptist theology and Baptist theology has been that from the beginnings of the Anabaptist movement in January 21st, 1525, when Conrad Grebel was rebaptized, and then the group rebaptized themselves, and the free church tradition sort of starts. They held not so much to the idea. You'll hear people use the phrase separation of church and state sometimes. What they really held to is what I call a divorcing of church and state. So they held the view that it was sinful for Christians to be involved in politics in any way, shape, or form. If you had, and so I shouldn't say all of them because there is some distinction of views among various Anabaptists like Balthasar Hubmaier and some later groups like the Waterlanders sort of moderated this a little bit. But the general Anabaptist consensus was church and state are completely divided entities. The church is God's people. The state is of the world. It's Satan's world. So if you're involved in that at all, you're not welcome in the church. So if you've ever served in the military because they're pacifists, you can't join the church and be a part of the military. You're not welcome here. But also, if you've never served in a magisterial position, so like I'm thinking in the 15th century or 16th century categories today, if you ever served in jury duty, you wouldn't have been welcome in an original Anabaptist church. They're so sharply divided that if you've had anything to do with the state or state service, that's just a whole different, totally separate word. So I would call that a divorcing of church and state. Whereas Baptists have historically held to a separation that recognizes both spheres as from God and allows for the church to be involved in the state. There's no problem with that. We're just recognizing that they're separate spheres. And that first comes to expression in Thomas Helwys and the way he develops the doctrine. But you were going to say something, sorry.
No, you're fine. I was going to say, weren't the Anabaptists also rather anarchist in some sense, where they were like, throw off the government, we don't need them to tell us what to do?
Initially, yes. There's some debates about Anabaptist origins and what's called monogenesis and polygenesis, like where they developed and how they developed. I think James Stayer is right that there were kind of a different ideas and groups that filtered into Anabaptist identity. And in the initial formulations of some of their Anabaptist identity, they did hold to some of them at least held to an almost anarchist idea. There was this awful fiasco in Munster where one group in particular thought that essentially Jesus had returned. One of them thought he was the Holy Spirit incarnate. And so they reshaped government after quote unquote Christian principles in this town, and things just became an absolute horrific mess. Most of the men left, so there were way too many women. So then they instituted polygamy. So each man had multiple wives. And then the way they exercised the ban and discipline, one of the leaders, Jan Leyden, when his wife disobeyed, he trampled her to death under his horse, as punishment, and thought just an absolute mess. In some of the initial origins, I think that was an Anabaptist impulse. But after the Peasants' Rebellion of the 1520s, and then the debacle, how do we say that word? The mess that happened at Munster.
The debacle.
debacle. Yeah. So after that instance, all Anabaptists were treated to a pacifist position that wasn't aiming at anarchy, that was really essentially just saying to the state, leave us alone. We'll leave you alone. You leave us alone. You do your thing. We'll do our thing. So from that point forward, all Anabaptists were essentially, I can't think of a single example that wouldn't be true. All of them from that point forward were pacifist and held to this divorce of church and state. But yeah, there was that earlier impulse that I think is part of an embarrassing part of initial Anabaptist history.
Mm-hmm.
But that's all a discussion for another time. Anabaptist theology is different.
Yeah, we're going to cover Anabaptist theology extensively in later episodes. But if you're already wondering like, wait, what? I thought Baptists and Anabaptists were the same thing and all that. I mean, just a little bit of a homework assignment for you. Go read the subheading of the 1611 London Baptist Confession of Faith. No, not 1611, but the London Baptist Confession of
the first London Baptist Confession and the second one. The second London Baptist
1769, I believe.
I want to say 1677 was when it was originally written. But then it was published and affirmed in 1689. So a lot of people will call it the 1689 Confession. It was actually written a few decades earlier, but that was when a group of churches came together and signed it and republished it and said, hey, we affirm this. So it's usually just called the 1689 Confession.
So just, I mean, you don't even have to read the whole confession. Just read the very top of the First London Baptist Confession where they say, the reason that we're writing this is so that people understand that we're not Anabaptists and you stop calling us that.
So really clear identifier. They didn't view themselves as Anabaptists.
They were very strongly against it, and they wrote their confession to explain how we're not. And so they're doing a lot of things we disagree with, and they're being persecuted for it. So don't mix the two of us up because we're not the same thing.
That's right. Which again, isn't to deny. I think there are, and we'll talk about this more later, there are some really important overlaps in Anabaptist and Baptist theology, and so some important overlaps in Anabaptist and Baptist identity. But I think the two are sharply distinct and should be distinguished. But anyways, okay, so that's the acronym in brief. I think there's some problems with it. I think you've mentioned already there's some problems with it. So I don't know if you want to start with kind of what you've identified as problems or walk through some of them that I put here, however you want to do that.
Let's just walk through each one. I think because we offered clarity on all of them, but I was withholding some critiques of them so far. And so biblical authority, for example, some of the things that immediately stick out to me on this is, one, so, and we're clarifying what we mean by that is the 66 books of the Old New Testament, so not the Catholic canon, and we're talking about the sole final authority of life and practice and things like that. What sticks out to me about that is just a Protestant distinctive. That does. If you told me that somebody believed in the 66 books as the final authority, they had biblical authority view. That doesn't tell me what of the vast denominational affiliations that they would have. So it is not a Baptist distinctive in that sense.
That's right. Yeah. I have exactly the same problem. I understand why so often in discussions of Baptist distinctives, people put it up at the top, up front, so that they can show, everything else we're doing, we're trying to just follow the Bible. So everything flows from biblical authority. But you're exactly right. It is not a Baptist distinctive in that it is something held by all Protestants. And again, if we don't even clarify what we mean by the canon, it's held by all Christians. It's not even a Protestant distinctive, right? Like all Christians hold to biblical authority. But specifically when we're thinking of Baptist distinctives, all Protestants hold to this idea of what is typically called sola scriptura, the idea of a 66-book canon that is the only infallible rule of faith or the final authority for faith and practice. So I think it's helpful to talk about as part of Baptist identity but it is absolutely not a Baptist distinctive. And what's dangerous here is if we label it as a Baptist distinctive, then people who grow up in a Baptist church and never have any exposure to their brothers and sisters in Christ in other denominational settings will just kind of assume, oh, they don't believe the Bible. Like I thought that growing up. I just assumed other denominations don't really believe in the Bible.
Yeah.
They don't believe in the authority of the Bible, obviously. That's a Baptist distinctive. That's not even remotely true. There might be Christian groups, and there are Christian groups that downplay biblical authority. That certainly that happens. That happens among Baptists too. But confessionally, the whole Protestant world, if they know their history and if they are confessional and kind of tied to the Protestant confessions, they hold the biblical authority. It is just absolutely not a Baptist distinctive in any way, shape, or form.
Yeah. And you have to believe in biblical authority to be a Baptist.
Right.
But again, believing it does not make you a Baptist,
right?
Specifically. Yeah.
Yep.
Okay. So then the next one would be autonomy of the local church. I mean, this one I've always thought is a particularly Baptist thing, is that you're not controlled by any other denominational leadership or elements. You don't have to answer to various other churches or I guess a system, sort of like I would think the United Methodists and things like that. You've got these different boards that oversee kind of all the various churches, and if you fall out of line with this doctrine, then you get corrected or all kinds of different things. Am I understanding that correctly?
Absolutely. And most other denominational structures, I should say, every one of these things in the Baptist acronym is held by more than Baptist. Like every one of these items, there are also other groups that hold it. But some of them are way less common.
You said every single one of these?
Yeah, every single one of these is held by at least one or two other groups. None of them are uniquely distinct to Baptists. Now, when I kind of reframe Baptist identity later, I have a slide where I'll kind of explain why I think that's okay. We still have a distinct Baptist identity when we put all of our Baptist distinctives together. But every one of these is held by at least some of the groups. Some of them are way less common, though. Autonomy of the local church is essentially just a part of the free church tradition. Anglicans don't hold to it. Presbyterians don't hold to it. Most Methodists, Episcopalians don't hold to it. In all those structures, you have either an individual or another set of elders or sometimes another set of churches that's over the particular local congregation. So that congregation is not autonomous. So it is certainly a less common view I think is an important Baptist distinctive. I don't think we'd be doing justice to Baptist distinctives if we didn't hold to and talk about autonomy of the local church.
Yeah.
That one can stay. I like it.
Yeah. I pulled up a list of the churches that the different denominations that hold to each of the different Baptist distinctives on the acronym. And it looks like Anabaptists, Pentecostals, Church of Christ, and Evangelical Free are the ones that hold to church, local church autonomy.
And a lot of non-denominational churches that don't have an affiliation, they would hold to.
I guess true.
Church.
Non-denom would fall into there as well.
Not every non-denom church.
Yeah, but maybe that's why I didn't pull up in this list, is because they're not a denomination.
Right. They're not. Usually they don't affiliate with any group. They're actually sometimes the most autonomous churches, because a lot of times they're completely disconnected from every other denominational body and association.
Ironically, that's a conversation for another time, but they basically are a denomination.
Most of them are honestly very Baptistic. Every non-denominational church that I've ever been in is essentially a Baptist church by another name. There's maybe one or two Baptist distinctives they might not hold to, but most of them are essentially Baptist in their church polity. We'll talk about church polity in a little bit. But
they either fall into Baptistic, Assemblies of God, or Church of Christ, or things like that are going to be all very similar in that regard. I think Assemblies of God also would believe in church autonomy, wouldn't they?
Yeah, they do.
I was going to say, because I grew up Assemblies of God, and I don't recall there being any sort of external element to that.
I could be wrong, but I'm thinking off the top of my head. The Assemblies of God is a Pentecostal denomination, part of the broader.
I guess world. Technically that would fall into the category of Pentecostal.
I don't think I can think of any Pentecostal. I could be wrong. That's not. I'm not a Pentecostal. Right. I don't normally run in the Pentecostal world, at least not too much. I have been part of a charismatic church for a long time. I'm not at the moment, but was for about 10 years. But we weren't the typical average charismatic church. We were essentially, we held every one of the Baptist distinctives. They would never have called themselves a Baptist church.
It was a very conservative Baptist, or it was a very conservative charismatic church.
Yeah, they were part of, for a long time, the Acts 29 church network. And I love the church. I loved everything about the church and enjoyed my time there, really grew there. But they held to every one of the Baptist distinctives. Most charismatics, I'm trying to think, I think every charismatic or Pentecostal group that I know of would hold to autonomy of the local church. I can't think of one that would be in a system outside of that. I shouldn't say that. Charismatic is a little bit more broad. You have charismatic Calvinists, you have charismatic Anglicans. There are people who are in denominational structures that are also charismatic, but every group that would call its denominational identity charismatic or Pentecostal that I can think of they would hold to autonomy of the local church.
Yeah. Yep. So once again, we have not narrowed down who we're talking about with this particular distinctive. So then we talked extensively about what the meaning of priesthood of all believers means. Now, is this one? What would I think we talked about how this is a relatively Protestant idea. So once again, it's kind of like the biblical authority thing. You're going to be hard pressed to find other Protestant denominations that don't hold this.
Yeah, I think every Protestant, if they know their history, every Protestant holds to it. It's really just it's an important idea, and it's usually a part of discussions about Baptist theology and Baptist distinctives. It's a key biblical doctrine. We want to teach it. It just isn't a Baptist distinctive itself. I don't think we should label it that way. All Protestants hold to it if they know their theology.
Yeah. Even this list that I'm looking at right here says that it's basically all Protestants. The only ones that would really dissent are the Roman Catholic or Orthodox. So, okay. So then we have 2 ordinances. So let's take these one at a time. We've got believers' baptism. So this is where there's going to be this is where the contention, I guess, comes in. There's going to be various groups that believe in believers' baptism. There are some Protestant denominations that hold to like infant baptism, which would by definition not be believers' baptism. So what are some of the other denominational groups that do also hold to believers' baptism?
Yeah, I mean, again, so
John Coffey, hold off on talking about immersion or not for just a second.
Yeah, sure.
Let's just look at the broad definition of this.
I do want to come back to that later because I think that's
absolutely. I do too.
That's a problematic inclusion for a reason.
Right. I'll do that next.
Believers' baptism. I'm sorry. Give me your question one more time. I just blanked out.
I was going to say before we get to the which kind of baptism, just on a broad sense, believers' baptism. What are some other denominations that hold to this?
Yeah. So John Coffey edited. I don't know if he did the whole series or just the first volume. I think the whole series. There's a big, massive set with Oxford University Press called The History of Protestant Dissenting Traditions. And it was written kind of as a companion to Oxford produced this massive history of Anglicanism, which has been for 500 years, really, depending on who you ask, much longer, the theological spectrum behind most of the all of the Church of England, but most of England. So as a companion, they said, well, what about all the dissenting groups, the independents and Congregationalists and Baptists and Anabaptists and Quakers and, you go on down the list, those that that were not Catholic, but dissented from the Anglican communion. So then they published this big, I think it's a 5-volume set now. There might be another volume planned. I don't know. Oxford History of Protestant Dissenting Traditions. In the first volume, John Coffey talks about, in his introduction, he talks about believers' baptism and how it's really important to many, if not most of those dissenting traditions, not all of them, but most of the dissenting traditions have held to believers' baptism in one form or another. And he points out well over half of the Protestant groups today hold to believers' baptism. So it's the most obvious thing that comes to people's mind when they say, oh, Baptist distinctives. What do Baptists do? What makes you a Baptist? Well, believers' baptism by immersion. It's the most visible. It's sort of the most right up front, and certainly the most well-known and the one that comes to people's mind. Yeah. But if you think through it, most of, maybe not most, many other Protestant groups have also practiced believers' baptism. If you walk into, we mentioned earlier, Assemblies of God churches. If you walk into an Assemblies of God church or really any Pentecostal church, almost any charismatic church, except for those that are associated again with like the Catholic charismatic movement or the Anglican charismatic movement, they're going to practice believers' baptism by immersion. Most non-denominational churches that you go to, they're going to practice believers' baptism by immersion. Even some groups that are sort of on the fringes of evangelicalism, like Christian churches, they technically practice believers' baptism by immersion. They believe baptism is essential for salvation. You can't be saved without it.
I was just getting ready to say, in this list on here, there's a lot of groups, but I noticed that it mentions Church of Christ. But Church of Christ technically believes that baptism is a regenerating work, which would not fall under the believer's baptism category.
But it does, because they won't baptize you as an infant. They require a confession of faith.
Wouldn't that just be a distinct? Yeah, okay, so then we would have to get into defining what we mean by believers' baptism, obviously, because I would make that a distinction between pedobaptism and creedal baptism. It's like,
okay. Except that, I mean, they are technically credo baptistic. And there's some distinction between churches of Christ,
they're credo
Christian
Baptistic
churches, and so on.
Right. I would say that they're credo Baptistic, but not believers baptism in the sense that like you get baptized after you are already. Okay. So if you're saying a believer in the sense of I believe in this confessional, like these doctrines, then I get baptized.
Right.
And then the baptism is what is a regenerating act. So I've heard this actually distinguished instead of believer's baptism as regenerate baptism, or sorry, not regenerating, but like baptism. What was it? The way it was worded is it's post regeneration baptism.
Yeah, no, that's a good way to put it. Post regenerative baptism. That's a good term. I think believers. I'll reframe these distinctives later. In one of these slides. I think we should see believers' baptism as flowing out of the idea of regenerate church membership. I think regenerate church membership is actually the core Baptist distinctive.
Yeah,
and believers' baptism, or believers' baptism by immersion, if you want to add that, is really an outflow of that idea. So it's the most visible thing, because it's what people think of when they think of Baptist. It's the thing that they see if they come and visit your church. We just last Sunday, the Southern Baptist Church that we were at had a baptism Sunday, and baptized, I think, like 20 or 30 people, just a massive influx of people being baptized. Well, anybody that comes and visits that service, they're watching believers' baptism by immersion. Oh, this is a Baptist church. So it's the most sort of upfront, but it's really not in that sense. It's not unique to Baptist. I think we can call it a Baptist distinctive, but I would reframe it as a part of the idea of regenerate church membership, which we'll get to later.
I completely agree with that. Yeah, we're going to dive into that more, and I'll explain kind of some of the qualms that I've had with some of the way that these are understood when we get to that. But like, for example, the believer's baptism, this list says that the Anabaptists, Mennonites, Amish, I don't even know what some of these are, some weird names. The ones that nobody else has probably heard of either, but Apostolic Christians, Church of Christ, some Pentecostals, Evangelical Free, coming from the non-denom and Assemblies of God, they also would do believers' baptism. So this, again, does not narrow down our list at all as to who we're talking about.
Which isn't to say it's not important. And even as an important part of Baptist identity. I think it is a very important part of Baptist identity. We just want to be careful that we're not leaving the misimpression that therefore we're the only ones that believe this. We're not.
Right.
We're not
you cannot be a Baptist and deny this element. Yeah. Now this is where some of the contention is going to come in. People are going to be like, okay, well, yeah, all those groups do different, whatever, but some of them don't do it by immersion. And so you want to speak to that a little bit?
I do, yeah. Let me jump slides a little bit. I've laid out we've kind of already discussed some of these, but I'll come back to them a little bit. Problems that I think with this way of laying out Baptist distinctives in the Baptist acronym. That second one there, it doesn't reflect all Baptist. And then, I don't remember where I put it in this list. Oh yeah, okay, the second one down there. The earliest Baptists and Anabaptists didn't immerse. Now we'll talk more about this in our later session. There's some discussion and debate about who were the first Baptists? Where did the first Baptist church start? The vast majority of historians, let me give kind of an overview of three broad views of Baptist origins. Again, this is just a preview. We'll talk more about this later. This is what we originally had planned for this interview, and now we're doing a whole separate session on Baptist identity, which is great. But what we're going to get to in one of the later sessions is the three basic views of Baptist origins. There's the English separatist view, which believes that Baptists came out of the English separatist matrix of Puritanism, so to speak, sort of a breakaway from the Church of England that had become first Puritan and then separatist and independent. That's the view held by the vast majority of Baptist historians today. Secondly, there's what's sometimes called the Anabaptist kinship view. In its original form, the idea was that there were other rebaptizing groups throughout church history, like the Donatists from way earlier in church history, and there's some kinship with them. And then today, the expression it typically takes is the idea that Baptists were connected to and maybe sort of sprang from the Anabaptists. We mentioned the Anabaptists began in 1525, and there's some possible overlap between Anabaptist and Baptist origins. So that's the second view. There are some good historians that hold that. We'll talk about that more later. And then the third view is Baptist successionism, the idea that there's just always been Baptist all the way back to Jesus, the most prominent version of that being landmarkism. So within that first view, English separatist origins, the vast majority of Baptist historians today land there. There's still debate about which group you should identify as the first Baptist. And one of the reasons for that is because the relationships get complex, and it starts really with John Smith and Thomas Helwys. who were Puritans in England. They become separatist in 1606, 1607. They flee to the Netherlands to get away from religious persecution. And while in the Netherlands, they come to the conviction that we should baptize believers, that we should have a regenerate church. And so they develop what most historians consider the first Baptist church, the Smith and Helwys congregation, that comes to the view of believers' baptism. John Smith writes really the first robust defense in church history of believers' baptism and a regenerate church. It had existed before, again, among the Anabaptists. And one of the reasons there's some debate about these different views of origins is there's questions about when did John Smith first connect with the Anabaptist groups that were in Holland. If he connected with them before he developed his views, then Anabaptists are flowing into Baptist identity. If he came to his views before he connected with the Anabaptists, then they're arising independently. Lots and lots of debate. There are dozens of journal articles written kind of tracing out those things. But anyway, Smith and Helwys come to the conviction that you should baptize believers. And so Smith actually rebaptizes himself, then baptizes Helwys, and then baptizes about 40 other people that are part of the community. So most historians would say that's the first Baptist church. But that baptism happened by pouring. It was effusion. That's how all the Anabaptist groups that were there were baptizing. That's how the Helwys Church baptized, and General Baptist. They kind of begin what's known later as the General Baptist Strand. They're practicing baptism by effusion for the first several decades of their existence.
Yeah, that detail is often left out in
it's
conversation.
Forgotten.
I did not know that. And because often it's presented as like, well, they baptize themselves and things like that, but it was still by immersion. It's like,
that's just kind of an assumption. And people typically assume that about Anabaptists too. They read about Anabaptists rebaptizing. But as J.G. Hoop du Scheffer pointed out about 100 years ago, he was an incredibly competent Anabaptist historian. He said Anabaptists have virtually never practiced immersion. To this day, they don't practice immersion. If you go to an Anabaptist church today, and there's many of them around, or one of the sort of subgroups within Anabaptism, whether that's those that followed Jacob Hutter that developed the Heverites, or those that followed Menno Simmons that became the Mennonites, or even the more extreme Amish group, they'll typically, if you go to a typical Anabaptist like website today or Doctrinal Confession of Faith, they'll say we'll accept either immersion or effusion, or sometimes even sprinkling. They're not specific about the mode because all throughout Anabaptist history, Anabaptists didn't immerse typically. You might find an example here or there where someone did, but it certainly wasn't required by them. And so in these early Baptist expressions, the earliest Anabaptist, not immersing. The earliest Baptist, if you take the Smith and Helwys group as Baptist, didn't immerse. Some people don't like to identify that group as the first Baptist group, and they instead point towards the origins of a church that developed in England, which we call the JLJ Church, Jacob Lathrop Jesse, because of the name of some of the pastors that held to it. That group also started as a kind of an outflow of the Puritan matrix and then became Congregationalists and independents, and then came to the conclusion, hey, actually the Bible teaches believers' baptism. So we should baptize believers. And they came to independently, completely separate from the conclusion that Anabaptists had come to in the early 16th century, completely separate from the conclusion that Smith and Helwys had come to in the Netherlands. They came to the conclusion, well, we should baptize only believers. But again, here's the problem. They practiced baptism as a mode the way that they'd been taught it. So for the first decade or two of that church, they didn't practice immersion. It wasn't until the 1630s or 1640s in what's called the Great Immersion Controversy in London that some members of that church, specifically Richard Blunt, came to say, well, wait a minute, if we're going to try and be as biblical as possible, it really seems like what Paul says about baptism imaging the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus, that would really be better typified by an immersion baptism. And it sparked this massive controversy and church split and pamphlet wars. And then immersion showed up. The first immersion in England happens in 1641. So there's this problem. If you hold the Anabaptist origins and want to connect them with Baptists, well, they didn't baptize by immersion. If you hold to the Smith and Helwys congregation as being the first Baptist church, well, none of them baptized by immersion. Or if you hold to the particular Baptist congregation in London being the first Baptist church, they didn't initially baptize by immersion. So either one of those three positions that you take, you run into a complex problem if you want to say, well, immersion is absolutely essential to be a Baptist. And there are some that say this. If you say that, then you don't have Baptist until 1641. So Glenn Staffson, 50 years ago, kind of picked up that idea and said we shouldn't call those earlier groups Baptist. Smith and Helwys were not Baptist. The Anabaptists were not Baptist. The JLJ Church at first were not Baptist. And Baptist didn't really exist until 1641. There's a major book today by Matthew Bingham that just came out a couple years ago called Orthodox Radicals. It's published with Oxford University Press. It's a really big, really important work in Baptist history. He's kind of on that train, and he says we shouldn't call those earlier groups Baptists. We should call the Smith and Helwis group Baptistic Arminians. We should call the earlier particular Baptists Baptistic Calvinists, but we can't really call them Baptists. And he has a big argument for why. Part of his has to do with the idea of he doesn't think Baptist identity was settled until the 1640s or 50s in the middle of the British Civil Wars. But part of that argument is to say, well, if you want to say that immersion is essential as a mode to Baptist identity, then that's the conclusion you're forced to. You're forced to end up saying, well, then there weren't Baptists until the 1640s. I prefer to let go of immersion a little bit. I think immersion is the right way to do things. I think it's got the clearest biblical precedent as a pattern. But I'm still fine saying I think the Smith and Helwis group was the first Baptist church, even though they didn't practice immersion. That was a long answer to your question. I hope that wasn't more than you wanted.
No, that's really helpful because so the way this is always presented to me is that Anabaptists were basically, they were rebaptizers. And the reason that they were labeled as rebaptizers is because they saw everybody else being baptized incorrectly. And so they rebaptized people by immersion. And so if what I'm understanding you're saying correctly, it was not that they saw everybody else was being baptized by another method and wanted to rebaptize them. It was that they saw that they were being baptized for the wrong reason and were rebaptizing them.
Exactly.
And the method was not immersion.
That's right. So, the method was pouring. We know very, very clearly in the accounts, the first Anabaptist immersion, and very clearly in their statements about their practice, Anabaptists just, again, I think you can find an individual here or there who was baptized by immersion, but they didn't require immersion. And the vast majority of them weren't baptizing by immersion. It is true. That first part of your statement was true. They did come to conclude our baptism is not valid. But the reason they came to conclude it wasn't valid is because they had been baptized before they were believers. And they've come to this principle of a regenerate church membership and say, oh, if the church is genuinely made up of just regenerate believers, then being baptized as an infant doesn't mean anything. It's just a mere empty symbol. And it's really funny. You mentioned Zwingli's view of the sacraments earlier, Zwingli's memorialism. Anabaptists actually sprang from the followers of Zwingli. There was a group of followers of Zwingli who had adopted that view, that memorial view of the Lord's Supper, and basically said, well, wait a minute. We need to hold the same view of ordinances. We need to press the Reformation further. And if we're going to hold that view of the Lord's Supper, then we need to hold that view of baptism too. So therefore, baptism is a ordinance that doesn't save, that's an act that's taken by a saved person. So it was actually Zwingli's memorial view that led them to form the Anabaptists, to form this idea of a regenerate church and believers' baptism that comes only after someone had believed. And they tried to convince Zwingli of that. There was a lot of debate between that particular group of Zwingli's followers and Zwingli himself. And Zwingli says at one point, I kind of played with the idea, but then basically I decided they were all heretics, and they started to be massively persecuted. First, because they refused to allow their children to be baptized as infants. As these pastors and thinkers were getting together, they said, well, if the Bible teaches that baptism should come after we believe, we're not going to submit our babies for baptism. And that was a hugely unpopular thing that was viewed as seditious at the time. So they came on the wrong side of the authorities. And then on that fateful night, they came together on 21 January 1525, and they had just lost a massive disputation over the subject. They come back to their home dejected. They pray, and they go, you know what? We're just going to do it what we think is the biblical way. And they rebaptize themselves. But yes, they rebaptize by pouring. Immersion doesn't come into Anabaptist identity except in a few occasional little pockets later. And again, it doesn't come into Baptist identity till the 1640s. So that's why I put that kind of in blue brackets.
Yeah.
Because I think we need to be careful there. I think believers' baptism by immersion is the most biblical model. If you were to sit down just with the New Testament and say, well, what model most matches the New Testament? I think you'd come to that conclusion. And I think it's fascinating that all those three different groups come to that conclusion independently. Like there's no connections genealogically between them coming to that conclusion. It's just people sit down with the Bible, and if you give people the Bible and say, I want to reshape baptism to look as much like it looks like in the New Testament, there's good evidence that on a number of different occasions, people took that step and went, oh, well, that means believers' baptism by immersion. Mm-hmm. But I think we need to be careful about adding that immersion to a tag for what we require as Baptist identity. Because if we do, all those groups aren't Baptist. The Smith and Helwis group, not Baptist.
Two things that immediately stick out to me. One is the question that raises of was baptism by immersion not always practiced by someone like by some churches?
Oh, sure.
Because like, for example, you mentioned these several different groups, and each one of them were baptizing in the way that they had been exposed to.
Yeah.
But then they came to the conclusion that they should do it by immersion. It wasn't something that they saw patterns. So then
Right.
where was the
That's right.
disconnect? Where was the break in immersion?
That's a really great question. In England, there's a great book by William Whitsitt that was written in like the 1890s where he traced out that question. He wanted to ask, when did immersion disappear and when did it come back? And so he kind of traces out. It's a dated book. It's maybe 100 years old, but it handles the data pretty well. And I don't think theologians or historians today have necessarily rejected his conclusion. He shows in the early church, there was definitely baptism by immersion. In the first century or two, I think you could show that in the first century or two, there may even have been believers' baptism by immersion. There's some debate about the data, but as you trace out kind of the apostolic fathers, and then specifically the mention in Tertullian, Gregory of Nazianzus, immersion existed as a practice and may have been the most common practice until Augustine. And it was in Augustine's theology, as he was wrestling with the idea of original sin, and then also wrestling with the pastoral problem of people whose children didn't live long, right? Just because of the health condition of the age. It was very common for someone to have an infant or a baby or a young child and it die before it reaches adulthood. So they were often wanting baptism for that individual because, man, what if he dies, without being baptized? So there began to be pastorally an interest in baptizing younger and younger children. And then Augustine built this idea theologically as a rationale for that. And he's arguing against the Donatists, which that's a whole discussion we could talk about later when we talk about landmarkism, because it gets misframed today sometimes. But as he's arguing against the Donatist, he comes up with a theology that says that baptism of infants is important because it's in infant baptism that original sin is removed. So that infant, until they're baptized, still has the stain of original sin's guilt, at least, on them. And it's infant baptism that takes that away. So we're talking the 5th century, the 450s or something like that. And then for the next 1,000 years of the church, really, that becomes the theological grounding for infant baptism. But there is still practice of baptism by immersion that takes place. It takes place in Roman Catholicism for a long time, takes place in Eastern Orthodoxy for a long time. And sometime in the medieval era, infant baptism by pouring or sprinkling. And again, sometimes infant baptism is done by immersion too. So sometimes people will latch on to immersion equals Baptist. Not at all.
Technically, have you ever watched a Roman Catholic baby baptism? It is definitely immersion.
Yeah. Well, there's some allowance for a couple different modes, but yeah, immersion can still happen. Happens today. But it was as infants. But then in England, what happens is the standard pattern for some of those reasons, because of Augustine's grounding, because of sort of the pastoral necessity, what becomes the standard pattern is infant baptism by pouring and sprinkling. So as these different groups are emerging out of the Reformation, that seems to be the pattern that they knew. So they took what they knew, tried to make it biblical, took steps towards what they saw as a biblical view. But in some cases, it took several decades before they landed at the conclusion of, actually, believers' baptism by immersion is the most biblical view. So that's something that didn't all happen at once. That's something that kind of slowly developed. Yeah. And it's why I'm really cautious about, should we say that believers' baptism is a Baptist distinctive? Absolutely, 100%. I think it's an important one. As I frame them later, I'll talk about how I think it's a really careful and important way to guard a regenerate church membership. But I don't think we should demand immersion and say, well, if it didn't happen by immersion, then it's not valid. Because I think we run into a real problem in Baptist history with that kind of a conclusion. So I'd practice immersion. I'd teach immersion. Mm-hmm. I wouldn't tell someone that their baptism wasn't valid if it wasn't by immersion. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So there's two things I'm thinking of. One, I would need to think about it, but I would probably personally push back on that as far as the validity of baptism. I think that just because you have an invalid baptism does not mean that you're unsaved or that you're not Baptist or things like that. I would think we can draw those lines, but I think that on other grounds, I would make the case that the baptism would be illegitimate in the sense that if I'm making the case to say that this is the way baptism should be done, well, then that by definition means I think that your baptism was done incorrectly. Anything other than that.
Sure.
So I wouldn't be willing.
And I will say you're with the majority of Baptists there. I'm taking an unpopular line. There.
And now to maybe a rather unpopular opinion that I have is it did not surprise me when you said that this ceased largely under Augustine. I feel like the more that I study things, and I'm like, man, there's this weird errant theology. Where did it start? And I trace it back. It always seems to come back to Augustine. I'm like, why am I surprised?
Oh, come on, that's not fair. That's not fair. I love Augustine,
dude. We have this joke at our church. My pastor and I, we joke around and say, if Augustine said it, you could probably bank on it being the opposite. And so, I mean, it's a little tongue in cheek because there are some things that he got right.
Oh yeah,
but there's a lot of things that he was way off on.
Yeah, I mean, I'd push back against that. I love Augustine. I have the highest esteem for Augustine, but I do agree with you. I think there's areas, and his view of baptism was one of them. I think there are some areas where Augustine got wrong. The problem was that Augustine was such an influential all of us get stuff wrong in our theology. All of us make mistakes. But Augustine became the single, outside of Paul, the single most influential theologian in the Western church. Like no one has shaped Western theology in particular more than Augustine, except for the Apostle Paul. And that's a statement that lots of historians and theologians would make.
And I think
so what happened was, anytime Augustine made a little mistake, and he did make some, like I think in his view of baptism, it became a huge church issue for 1,000 years because he was so influential. Well, I'm grateful for his influential legacy in so many of the areas he got right, his views of grace, his passionate love for the Lord, his devotional prayers in the confession, and his understanding of depravity. I'm grateful for so much of his theology. But one of the dangers of being that influential is that if you do make a tiny error, I think we talked about this in a previous episode, you make a tiny little error in angle, it might not have been a big deal in Augustine's own lifetime and would have just disappeared. But because he was so influential, if you're off just a little bit in an angle, 1,000 years down the road, if you carry the kind of influence that Augustine did, that becomes a huge error in the church. And I think that happened in a number of ways.
The church kind of follows some of those viewpoints down their logical train tracks, and you end up at the end of the line going, whoa, hold on a second, how we get here? But I think also some of the differences there, in my opinion, of Augustine would likely, some of these subjects we haven't talked about, but likely would come down to a difference in even in what you and I would hold on various positions. Because there's some positions that you may come back to and agree with Augustine, but I'm finding that the majority of things that I'm reading and studying and I have my positions on, I'm looking at what Augustine taught on that, and I'm like, I don't agree with that. And so and there may be some difference there. That's true. But that's a whole nother.
Well, we could agree to disagree on how much we like Augustine. Hey, that's a non-essential.
Here's the thing. Oh man, I'm tangled up. I have this right here. So I've got the Confessions.
Oh, wonderful.
It's beautifully bound too.
That does look beautiful.
It's a really nice book, but anyway.
Wonderful. So, well, at least you'll read Augustine, so we can still be friends. I'm totally tongue-in-cheek. I love you to death as a brother, whether you like Augustine or
not. But this is fun because it's I like that we can disagree and still learn things from each other and grow and things like that. But okay, so let's go to the Lord's Supper. So we talked about that one. Non-salvific Lord's Supper. The various positions as obviously we talked about transubstantiation, the Lutheran concept, the Calvinist concept, the Zwinglian concept, and so and then obviously the open, close, and closed. There's been a plethora. I'm pretty sure I could be wrong about this, but would I be far off in saying that every single one of the possible positions on that have been held by Baptists historically?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Okay. There, and not just one or two Baptists here or there. There have been many Baptists who have been. In fact, we should say something about those three positions. Let me just briefly explain what those are. Open. There's a couple different ways to lay these
let's
out in
define
different
that.
terms to use. Not everybody uses these terms. These terms that I'm using, open, closed, and close, I'm following.
And some people are define them differently as well. And
Right,
so
exactly.
it'd be important to say what we're meaning when we're talking about this.
Exactly. Yeah. There's in John Hammett's book on biblical foundations for Baptist churches, actually, I have that here. He walks through a little bit of the different ways that terminology has been used.
Right here.
I don't remember the page number or where exactly in here, but he does talk in here about
I've been reading this lately.
Oh, that's excellent. It's a classic on Baptist ecclesiology. Really, in fact, I think I put it on the list that I was going to send to you because it's just
very, very
a
good.
classic. Hammett's very well known for a classic of Baptist ecclesiology.
Yeah.
Anyway, he has a section there, maybe a couple pages, where he talks about the different terminology. So let me explain the terminology I'm using.
I think let me pause you on that. I actually think I might disagree with the way that he lays out these different positions too. And so I don't know if you're going to follow his.
I'm not. I just want to mention that he discusses the terms.
I'm not. He actually defines them a little differently, and it takes you a little bit to realize, oh wait, he's not meaning the same thing.
Yeah. What I am following is Greg Allison.
Okay, cool.
And Sojourners and Strangers, another excellent work on ecclesiology. I'm actually in soteriology and ecclesiology course with Dr. Allison right now. I haven't done a lot of the reading yet. I hope Dr. Allison isn't watching this yet. Still got a bunch of reading to do before we meet in December. But I have read his ecclesiology, this one, and the smaller version, which I highly recommend. If someone's just starting and reading about the church, we'll talk more about ecclesiology in a minute when we get to kind of the way I lay out Baptist principles. He's written this marvelous, excellent little short, brief intro guide type thing to ecclesiology. This is a marvelous series, by the way. I love it. Crossway does it. It's short studies in systematic theology, and they take authors that have written big, fat, massive, well-respected textbooks and say, hey, give us a version of that in 150 pages. So it's a great series if you're just starting and looking for a short, thin little book.
It's the TLDR version of the the scholarly material.
Yeah, which is great because they don't assign people to write who haven't already written heavily and widely in that area.
Cool. That's awesome.
So those scholars take stuff that they've written sometimes in 500 or 1,000 or 2,000 pages and condense the best of it into 100 pages. But in his fuller work, it's not in the smaller work, but in his fuller work, Greg Allison lays out views of the supper, and the terminology that he uses in defense is open, closed, and close. And what he means by those terms, again, you're right, those terms can be used differently and different terms can be used for the same ideas. But what he means by those terms is the open view is any Christian is welcome to the supper. So you're having the Lord's Supper, someone's coming and visiting your church, you're a Baptist church, they come from a Methodist church, but they're believers, you welcome them to the supper. A view that has never been held by Baptists is the view of the Lord's Supper as a converting ordinance, the idea that we welcome unbelievers to the supper. That is a view held in various churches out there. Baptists have never held that view.
And by inviting them to it, you don't mean you mean invite to partake, correct?
Yeah, exactly. Someone's here, they're an unbeliever, they tell you they're an unbeliever, and you say, hey, come take the Lord's Supper anyway. We believe this will bring grace to you and can kind of draw you to Christ. That's something very well established in church history.
Right.
Lots of churches have held that view. No Baptists have ever held that view. So I'm laying out what I consider, as we're talking about Baptist distinctives, the views that have been held by Baptists in terms of who can partake. There are other views about what the supper means, but in terms of who can partake, open, close, and close. Open means any Christian is welcome to the table. If they're a believer, they're welcome to come to the table. Close, as Greg Allison uses it, again, some people use these terms differently. Close, as he uses it, means anyone who's been baptized in a Baptist church or is in good standing with what we'd recognize as a genuine New Testament church is welcome to partake. So we're First Baptist Church of Oklahoma City. Someone comes and visits from a Baptist church in Washington. They're a believer. They're a Baptist. We welcome them to the table. Any Baptist can partake, or anyone who's in good standing with the local New Testament church.
And from what I understand, there's also a level of, because with open communion, there's no level of filtering or accountability there as far as who is or isn't saved. It's just like, whoever comes and takes. I think even with close, from my understanding of it, there is a little bit of a filter there in that. You don't just be like, oh yeah, come on and partake.
Yeah, exactly.
There is still a check that's like, hey, we're going to make sure that you're in good standing with your church before you participate and things like that. So there's
still and we call
that
those checks and filter is usually referred to as fencing the table.
Yeah, the fencing.
The idea is we're going to partake. This is the Lord's table. Here's not everybody's welcome here. here's who's welcome here. So all three of these views in some way are fencing the table.
Right.
The open view is fencing it and saying, hey, only believers this is an ordinance for believers. This is usually the view that's taken, this is an ordinance of the universal church. So if you're a believer, you're welcome to this table. Then there's the close view, which fences the table a little more tightly and says, hey, you need to be a member of a Baptist church that we recognize as a genuine New Testament church that you're in good standing with. So it fences the table a little more tightly. Then the most narrow view, that's been the most common Baptist view, but both of those views have been very common in Baptist history, open communion and closed communion. There is a third view that Allison calls closed communion. Sometimes people use those terms close and close synonymously, and again, the terms get used different ways. The way Allison's using it is what is sometimes called local church only, or the landmarkist view of the Lord's Supper that developed primarily in landmarkism, where there was an emphasis on the local church. And then for many of them, they concluded the only type of church is the local church. There is no universal church. So therefore, this ordinance is a local church only ordinance. So in order to fence the table a little more tightly, the only people that are welcome, we're First Baptist Church in Oklahoma City or Dallas or wherever, the only people that are welcome to this table are the people who are members in good standings of this particular local Baptist church. If you're visiting us from a Baptist church in Washington, we love you, we respect you, we recognize you, but you can't come to our table. That's a much, much more narrow view that has never been the standard Baptist view. It really arose during the landmarkist controversy in the 19th century. It was held for a time by a lot of Southern Baptists, but it's never really been a majority Baptist view. And certainly today, it is not the majority Baptist view. So anyway, that's an overview of those three terms.
Yeah, I was going to say that's actually the position that I take and our church takes is closed. And we don't make it for the same reasons that I've heard arguments made previously. It has to do with our parsing out of what exactly the purpose is of the Lord's Supper. And it's not to say that other people who do it differently are just, whatever. But we do, our church practices it as a closed communion because there are really good cases to be made about the ordinance being practiced by a local church as something that is done collectively as that body in a unifying manner together. And so in some of the ways that you parse that out and define that, it would not necessarily allow for it to be a close in that sense, where you would invite other people in to partake in that sort of way. And so that's kind of,
and I get that. I will say I think there are some good solid arguments for a closed view. I don't personally hold a closed view. In fact, I hold an open view. But I used to a long time ago, I held a closed view while I was at Heartland, and then I kind of shifted to a closed view. And today I've become more convinced of an open view. But one of the benefits of Allison's work that I'll mention, he builds a solid case for each view. So like when it comes to the closed view, I think he lists 8 biblical arguments he doesn't hold it, but he's wanting to be fair to the position. So he says, here are the arguments. What's that?
He tries to steel man them.
Yeah, exactly. He tries to steel man them. So he says, here's 8 solid biblical arguments that they've offered for that view at different points in history and different places. So he presents a really good representation of the view. He ultimately disagrees with it. I ultimately disagree with it. But that's not to say there's no arguments for it. There are.
He ultimately takes what position? Close or close?
He takes a close view. He holds a sort of a modified close view, I think is what he calls it, of the Lord's Supper. But yeah, anyway, I'm not saying that there's not arguments that can be made for it. There are. But my main point is to say we shouldn't identify one of those views. Yeah, in terms of this discussion, we need to be really careful not to take one of those views and say that's the Baptist view. So if you don't agree with that view, then you're not a Baptist. That happens sometimes. I've seen many times, especially where this acronym is used, they'll have a little note or a side explanation and kind of demand that this is the one right view. Where you land on one of those views is not a Baptist distinctive, period. It doesn't identify you as have to agree with that to be a Baptist. Baptists have held all 3 of those views throughout history.
Yeah.
Anyway.
So then as far as the Lord's Supper goes, did we touch on this where what are some of the other groups that would also basically do the exact same thing? So
that's a good question. When you talk about the Lord's Supper, there's sort of a whole spectrum of related issues. So during the time of the Reformation, especially, you can think of sort of about half a dozen questions that came up and how different people would answer those questions, put them on a whole sort of spectrum of views. The first and most important question related to transubstantiation, like you talked about earlier. But the question actually was phrased this way: after the bread and wine are consecrated, do bread and wine remain? So in the Catholic transubstantiation view, do the substance of bread and wine remain? After the priest elevates and consecrates the host and says the words of consecration, the bread and wine are transformed in their substance into the body and blood of Jesus.
Mhm.
Now, we do have to do a little bit of philosophy here to kind of understand this view. So the individuals who articulated this view in the late antiquity, and then especially the medieval era, and Thomas Aquinas is probably the preeminent and fullest expression of transubstantiation. As they develop this view, they're building on Aristotle's categories and his distinction between substance or essence and accidents. So we could think of essential characteristics, primary characteristics, and secondary characteristics. So, for example, there are things about Tim that make me who I am. Without them, I am not me. If you chop my head off and I don't have a brain anymore, I am no longer Tim, right? That's a sort of essential characteristic. But there are also secondary properties that I can change that don't affect whether I'm still Tim or not. I shaved my beard from the last time I was on this channel. That was a accident, meaning it was a secondary characteristic of who I am. I can change in that matter and not affect who I am. But if I were to change in my absolute essence and substance, then I would become Bob and not Tim. That's not a possible thing, technologically. But people are probably a bad example. I should have picked like a green ball or something. You can have a green tennis ball and you can paint that green tennis ball red and it is still a tennis ball. By changing its color, you've only changed a secondary characteristic, what Aristotle would call an accident. You haven't changed the essence. So in transubstantiation, the view is the bread and wine are changed in their essence. They are now actually, their matter, their substance is Jesus. In other words, the incarnate Christ just showed up bodily in church, which is why when the host is consecrated and elevated, people bow down and worship the bread. Because it's no longer bread. It's now Jesus bodily present. So it's an act of adoration. So the reformers were constantly asking this question, do you believe that the bread and wine remain? If you answer yes, the bread and wine remain, then you're denying transubstantiation. That's still bread and wine. Whatever else I might think about whether Jesus is present, how Jesus is present, what the supper does, who it's for, if I think bread still remains, I deny transubstantiation. So that's kind of the first qualifying question that they would ask. The second question, is Christ present? And if so, how? As you mentioned, Zwingli takes this fully memorial view that we could call the doctrine of the real absence. So Zwingli takes this memorial view, and there's really no sense in which Christ is specially present in the supper. But a number of theologians disagree with him. Luther disagrees vehemently. He's adamant. Jesus said, "This is my body." And in fact, in a disputation that takes place among the reformers, the legend is that while they were having this discussion, Luther wrote out on the table either, I don't remember if it was a pen or if he carved it, but he writes out the Latin phrase, hoc est corpus meum, Jesus' phrase, "this is my body." He's got it covered by a blanket. And as they're going on in the discussion, he refuses to let that go. Christ is present in the supper, even though some of the other reformers disagreed. And in the midst of the discussion at one dramatic point, he throws off the blanket and shows, this is what Jesus said. Jesus said, "This is my body." It absolutely is my body. So there's disagreement about, do bread and wine remain? Is Christ present in the supper? If he's present, how? Is this a presence that is somehow still physical? In other words, that when you munch on the bread, I forget the Latin phrase, manducatio something. When you munch on the bread, you are still in some sense munching Christ. Even though bread still remains, Christ is still somehow physically present. Most of the reformers would go on to reject that and say, okay, well, he's spiritually present, but he is still in some sense present.
Position,
yeah, exactly. You get Calvin's spiritual presence later developed. There's sort of a distinction between real presence and spiritual presence. Anyway, you develop this spectrum based on how you answer that question. But then you've got the separate question, what does the supper do? Does the supper bring benefits? If so, what are the benefits? Again, on one extreme, you've got Zwingli. Supper does nothing. It's a memorial. I shouldn't say nothing. An image or a memorial is a thing. It is something. But it doesn't bring any particular spiritual benefit to the recipient. As you take the Lord's Supper, you're imaging the Lord's death until he comes, but there's no actual grace that's imparted. There's nothing that specifically happens. Some would answer that question, well, what it brings is forgiveness of sins. Others would answer that question and say, well, it brings a type of regeneration. Others, well, it brings a grace, but the grace that it brings is not saving grace, which that's the view that the earliest Baptists took. They took kind of a reformed view of the Lord's Supper. They viewed Christ as present in a spiritual sense. He's not absent. They're not Zwinglians. And there's a benefit to the recipients which is a grace, but it's sanctifying grace, not saving grace. And I'll mention a book that does a really good job laying out that history. Michael Haken, one of my professors at Southern, he wrote a book called Amidst Us Our Beloved Stands, which he's quoting a Baptist hymn. And it's all about Baptist sacramentalism. He's showing how the earliest Baptists, especially among the particular Baptists, they did not hold the memorial view that has become really common today among Baptists. They didn't believe in a doctrine of the real absence. They believed that Christ was spiritually present in that Reformed view and that there was grace imparted in the supper. Not saving grace, but sanctifying grace. So that was the common Baptist view in their initial origins, I think. Well, at least in the particular Baptist origins. I don't think Smith and Hill was held to quite as a Reformed view of the supper. But anyway, then there's another question.
Zwingli's view has kind of led to, I say kind of, seems to have be the main thing that has led to modern Baptist communion services feeling like a funeral.
Yeah.
Which I actually take issue with. I think that's an improper way of administering and partaking in the Lord's Supper. But that is the predominant way that you see it going. It's very, very individualistic, very self-focused, very you and God alone, and don't talk to anybody, don't smile, don't laugh at it. It's all very somber. Very somber. It feels like a funeral, and I don't think that's a proper method of administering the Lord's Supper. But
it's so funny to hear you say that. I mentioned earlier, because I've kind of come to the same view. I started with that sharply memorial view, and practice the Lord's Supper in deep solemnity. And I'm not opposed to a church that does that. I just disagree with them. That's their church. They can do it as they see fit. Religious liberty. We'll get to that in a minute. But today I've come to hold the view much more closer to a Reformed view, although I'm not Reformed in all of my theology. But in terms of the Lord's Supper, I think there's a real presence of Christ, and I think there's grace imparted in the supper. But I always have to explain when I say that to someone, so you're not a Baptist. No, I actually am a Baptist, and not only am I a Baptist, that's the standard common Baptist view in the 17th and 18th centuries. Like I'm in line with history, and I invite you to check out history a little bit more closely. Anyway, like I said, we're going to get way off if we go into every one of those.
I see your cat is harassing you as well.
Yes,
mine was just now yanking on my cable, almost yanked my headphones off.
I should have introduced you to Beans and held him up. Usually I do this kind of thing in my office where I'm kind of locked away from him, and now we're in his domain right now.
Yeah,
he owns this part of the apartment.
Yeah, my office is also Duncan is my cat's name. It's also his room, and so
I totally get it.
Left the door cracked this time. Normally I lock him out, but I heard him trying to get in, so I let him in to go, eat some food and go to the restroom, and then he wanted to go outside, so he started harassing me and yanking my cords and stuff like that. But now he's gone. So
we brought the cats into the Baptist fold.
Yes. Anybody that doesn't like that can get over it.
Well, let me jump back. I know we've kind of zoomed into a bunch of things, but I did want to mention, as we talk about the Baptist acronym, before we kind of lay out, let me just kind of summarize. And we've said all these things somewhat already. Let me sort of briefly summarize what I think are some problems with the acronym. And then you can come back if you've got some extra that you want to add to that. Some of these we've already treated. Number one, there's some items essential to Christianity that are absent from it, right? Like the Baptist Distinctives Acronym doesn't say a word about the Trinity, the deity of Jesus. There's no mention of the cross, no mention of the gospel. And someone might say, oh, well, there's no reason for it to. These are Baptist distinctives. It's not saying everything that we believe. It's just saying the things that distinguishes us Baptists. Well, I would say two things. That first, I don't think that's a good idea. I don't think we should ever forefront the things that make us Baptist and then just leave unsaid the things that make us Christians. And I'll explain what I mean by that more in a minute. But secondly, if you say that, then I have this second objection, because if that's true, almost half this list, as we've already talked about, are items that are not distinct to Baptists, but are shared by all Protestants. So they're not, if that's what you mean by the list, is things that make us uniquely Baptist, well, at least 3 of those items are shared by all Protestants: biblical authority, priesthood of the believers, and the 2 ordinances. All Protestants hold to those things. So they're not Baptist distinctives at all. So that's just not the way I would frame things. And third, I think we mentioned this earlier, when we talk about individual soul liberty, I don't like that phrasing. I get that Dwayne was doing it to make the I fit, but that phrasing is part of that E.Y. Mullins's take on soul liberty and individual soul liberty. That's the way he framed things. It was a very individualistic type take that became part of that sort of second stream of Baptist identity. And I don't agree with that stream. Like, I completely think that stream of understanding Baptist identity is wrong. Then thirdly, and we've mentioned, I think, each of these already, but let me quickly recap some of them that we haven't. The list doesn't reflect all Baptists. First, the early Baptists, when we talk about Smith and Helway's, the early General Baptists, the early Particular Baptists, they held to 3 offices. almost universally, the early Baptists held the 3 offices. They had, yes, pastors/elders/bishops, and yes, deacons. But then they had a third office that has kind of disappeared today that they called messengers/apostles/church planners. They viewed that as a separate office in the church. Usually you serve as an elder first, then you'd become a messenger. But they did not hold, if you came into them, 200 years ago and walked into one of those Baptist churches and said, oh, well, we believe in 2 offices, they just look at you funny. No, we believe in 3 offices. What are you talking about? So the idea of making that a Baptist distinctive, again, is just really problematic historically. That's not to say I believe in 3 offices. I do think all the gifts continue today, but I think 2 offices is a good way to explain things. I just don't think it's a Baptist distinctive. Secondly, we've mentioned already, the earliest Baptists and Anabaptists didn't immerse. Thirdly, the early Baptists didn't hold a memorial view of the supper, so I don't think we should include that. And then also, when we talk about 2 ordinances, again, all Protestants hold to that really, because Luther took the 7 sacraments and cut them down to 2, and everyone who's followed Luther has held that there's just 2. But then also the early Baptists, they held to 3 ordinances, a lot of them, not all of them, but a lot of them held that foot washing was an ordinance as well. So they just wouldn't fit in that mold. So there's problems in that it doesn't reflect all Baptists, is not distinctive of Baptist. And then lastly, and this is actually my biggest problem with the acronym, there's items that are essential to evangelical identity or even essential to Baptist identity that are absent. So for example, there's no mention of justification by faith, which is essential to be an evangelical. But secondly, and most importantly of all, this is my biggest critique with the acronym, there is no mention of congregational church polity. I don't think you can be a Baptist if you don't hold to congregational church polity. Now you might argue that
is a true Baptist distinctive.
That is a true Baptist distinctive.
As in, like, there are no other groups that hold to that.
I think there are some groups. I think every one of the Baptist distinctives is held by other groups. You do have some other groups that are congregational. Anabaptists were congregational. The Congregationalists in England were congregational.
I mean, fair, yeah.
And we've mentioned some other groups that are kind of similar. Non-denominational groups are usually congregational. Some charismatic groups are usually congregational Pentecostals. So it's held by others, but it is a genuine Baptist distinctive that many authors who've written on Baptist distinctives would say this is the core Baptist distinctive. I'll mention later, I think there's 2 that historians or theologians usually identify as the core of Baptist identity: regenerate church membership and congregationalism. But no one who writes on Baptist distinctives fails to mention congregationalism or fails to see it as an essential core Baptist distinctive. Mm-hmm. Like, it is essential to what it means to be a Baptist. I think we could even argue it's one of the 2 most essential things that it means to be a Baptist. Many would argue it's the most essential thing to hold to what it means to be a Baptist. And it's absent from this acronym. That's a real problem. So I've given kind of some lists. You probably have some other things that you would mention as well, but that's kind of my summary problems.
Yeah, I was going to say, by congregationalism, just for clarity for people that maybe aren't familiar with the term, what we're meaning is that congregational church governance. And so that the church is not run by, the elders or the pastor or the or some board somewhere else, like a bishop or some sort of hierarchy,
body outside of the church.
So it does go in local church autonomy. It kind of flows out of that, and so and is a qualifying explanation of what exactly we mean when we're talking about that. And so it means that essentially the local church is the authority rests in the congregation, not in a single person or something outside of that church.
That is exactly right. I have some charts I'll show in a minute to explain, but that's exactly right.
So, like, for example, the pastor is not the final say and authority on everything. That's is the congregation. This is why we have voting. This is why we do other elements of different the pastor and the leadership is held accountable by the church. The congregation elects those to represent them in certain areas and to take on certain responsibilities, but they're still accountable to the congregation. And
that is exactly right.
That's that is the specific distinction of what we mean by congregationalism.
Yeah. And it's essential to being a Baptist. Mm-hmm. There are Baptist churches today that have departed from that.
Right.
I think they've not only abandoned their Baptist heritage, I think they've abandoned their Baptist identity.
Yeah.
When you no longer function with a congregational church polity, I don't think you're a Baptist church anymore. Mm-hmm. You might still have the name Baptist on the sign, but you're really not a Baptist church.
And a lot of them give lip service to congregationalism as well, but in practicality, they do not practice it. So
that's exactly right. But we'll talk about that more in a minute when we get to congregationalism.
Yeah. So whenever you take this acronym, just as a quick kind of overview, as you were talking about the acronym, I didn't realize, man, how much time we've already spent on this.
Yeah, I know we took so long to go through it all. Sorry about that.
No,
I can be
fine.
long-winded.
I'm fine with that. It's just funny because our conversations always end up like, you're like, where did the time go? So, as an overview, so that we don't have to spend a ton of time going through each of these other ones individually, whenever you look at all of them, the main thing that we kind of had as a theme going through them is that the problem is they're not held by Baptists solely. So if you were to take all of those different distinctives and you were to look at them, I mean, you kind of left with still several groups that you could fall into, because you have, again, we talked about individual soul liberty being an element that is kind of largely Protestant rather than Baptist specifically. Saved church membership. This one gets a little interesting because it depends on who. That's going to be different depending on the church. So that's not really a denominational distinctive that I've observed necessarily. It seems to be like any church can implement that if that's the way that they do membership. Am I incorrect in that?
Yeah, I mean, well, so first I would say I really prefer the historical term regenerate church membership. Saved church membership, I don't know that it existed before the individual put this acronym together in the 1960s. Maybe it did. But the historical term was regenerate church membership. And I do think regenerate church membership is a core Baptist distinctive and a core distinctive of I should say a core element of Baptist identity. That doesn't mean there's not other churches that hold it. There are. Right. As I'll say in a minute, no matter how you frame Baptist distinctives, I think you're going to find every one of them is held by some other groups. But if we talk about what actually makes a Baptist, I'm going to argue in a minute. I think there's really two things that are the core principles. One of them is a regenerate church membership, and the other is a congregational church polity. And the other things that we call Baptist distinctives really flow out of those two central principles. So I do think it's a core Baptist distinctive.
And everything kind of comes out of that.
Okay. I think it's a headwater, but I don't like the phrase saved church membership. Because historically, for 400 years, the phrase that Baptists have used to talk about this is regenerate church membership.
Now, I'm curious as to why you would make a distinction between saved and regenerate. In my mind, they're both the same, but I may just be using them the same way. So,
I don't think they mean two different things. I want to use the historic language.
Term. Okay.
Yeah, the historic language developed from an emphasis on not just the doctrine of salvation in the Bible, but specifically the doctrine of regeneration, right? Like the idea of the new birth. Jesus says there's a second birth, there's a new birth from above. So it was grounded specifically in the doctrine of regeneration. And the language that was used for 400 years was regenerate church membership. We need a regenerate church. All the way back to like Helwes' first confession in 1611. He talks about, I can't remember the exact phrase, but the idea of a regenerate body, or only the regenerate are of the body, something like that. Like it has deep historical roots. And I don't think we should abandon a phrase with 400 years of history just because it fits our acronym better to say S instead of R. You know what I mean? Like there's such a deep, important phrase, such an important part of Baptist identity. I just want to hold on to that phrase, regenerate church membership.
Okay, cool. So then, let's continue on with what you were saying.
So what I wanted to say, I think the Baptist Distinctives acronym, you can use it if your church uses it, that's fine. Please add the qualifications that I've noted along the way to be more clear. I personally don't use it, and I don't recommend that you use it. I think it's got enough problems that we could do better. But if we do better, I think one of the first things that we need to do, and we've talked about this around and around in circles already, the idea of, well, is this distinctly Baptist? Well, other groups hold this. I think we need to be careful to frame Baptist identity as a broader part of first Christian identity. So let me read a statement from Fisher Humphreys. I actually haven't read this work, but I saw it quoted, and I really loved the statement. I forget, maybe Stan Norton quoted, maybe Norm Stanton quoted it, maybe Nettles, I can't remember. He said this: to understand Baptist, one must attend not only to the beliefs distinctive of Baptist, but also to the beliefs that Baptists hold in common with other Christian groups. Man, I think that is such a good statement. If we're going to frame Baptist identity, we need to pay really close attention, not just to distinctive Baptist ideas, but we need to pay attention to ideas that Baptists hold that connect them to broader Protestantism. And again, we kind of talked in circles through some of these ideas about how they do connect to broader Protestantism. So the way I would present Baptist identity and Baptist distinctives, I think we should think in terms of two sort of categories of views. This terminology, I don't know if it's original to me, maybe it is. Certainly this way of framing things isn't. I'm kind of following Norman and Nettles and Haken and a few others, although some of the specifics are my own tweaks. But there's precedent for this, I promise. So two broad categories of beliefs. first I'm going to talk about what I call Baptist prerequisites and then what I call Baptist principles. By Baptist prerequisites, I mean things that you have to believe before you can be a Baptist. And then by Baptist principles, I mean what usually are called Baptist distinctives. So let me give you kind of 4 broad overviews, and then I'll fill them in, and I'll try to be real quick. Under Baptist prerequisites, I think we need to think in terms of prerequisites of orthodoxy. Before you can be a Baptist, you have to hold to Orthodox Christian faith. And secondly, I think you have to be an evangelical. I don't think you can be a Baptist if you deny the basic core elements of evangelical faith. And we talked, I think, in an earlier interview about sort of the rise of evangelicalism and the things that evangelicals believe. Then I think we can move on to more distinctively Baptist views and specifically a Baptist ecclesiology. And I think we've got 2 central core principles that you've got to hold to be a Baptist: regenerate church membership and congregational church policy. And I think there's some distinctives that flow from those as core principles. So let me fill those in just real quick. When we think about prerequisites of orthodoxy, I don't think you can be a Christian unless you believe in the triune God, right? Father, Son, and Spirit, one essence, 3 persons, the way it was framed at Nicaea. Maybe you don't have to use the Nicene language. I think you should. But even if you don't use the Nicene language, you have to hold to the triune God or you're not a Christian. You have to hold to the God-man, the Chalcedonian Christology that sees Jesus as truly God and true man, 2 natures. Again, you don't have to, I like Chalcedon. I think you should confess the creed of, or the symbol of Chalcedon. But if you don't, you at least have to hold the idea, or you're not a Christian. If you deny the deity of Jesus, you're not a Christian. And if you're not a Christian, you're not a Baptist.
Right.
Then thirdly, the gospel. Again, sometimes we just say, well, we're teaching Baptist distinctives, so I don't need to say these things. I think that's really dangerous. If we forefront our Baptist distinctives and leave unsaid the Trinity and Christology and the gospel, we leave the impression that the most important things that we believe are the things that make us distinct from other Christians. That is fundamentally untrue, and it's theologically dangerous. The most important things we believe are the triune God, the 2 natures of Jesus, and the gospel that shows us a God-man that came down, was crucified, buried, he died for our sins, he was bodily resurrected, he ascended into heaven, and he's coming again. Those are the cardinal Christian faith. And if you don't hold those, you can't be a Christian, let alone be a Baptist. And we don't want to leave those things unsaid. So as we teach Baptist distinctives and Baptist identity, I think we need to be careful first to say, hey, here's the things I believe that make me a Christian. Then the things that I make me a Baptist. So prerequisites of orthodoxy. Then I think we should also teach prerequisites of evangelicalism. I don't think you can be a Baptist without being an evangelical, which means holding to salvation by grace alone, or sola gratia, justification by faith alone, or sola fide, and biblical authority. Yes, I think biblical authority belongs in our discussion of Baptist identity. We just need to understand this is what makes us an evangelical. So we share that with all evangelicals. And then you have to be an evangelical to be a Baptist. So prerequisites of orthodoxy, prerequisites of evangelicalism. I really love this statement from Tom Nettles as he kind of lays out a really similar paradigm. He says, one must first be a Christian before he can be a Baptist. So this idea that we think of Baptist identity as just these distinctives, and you can hold them whether you're a believer or not. And people in history, many people in history have called themselves Baptists, been Baptist churches, and they've denied each of these things. They didn't believe in the Trinity. They didn't believe in the deity of Jesus. They didn't believe in biblical authority. I would say they're not really Baptist. And we need to be careful as we talk about Baptist distinctives to first talk about these prerequisites and say, well, you need to be Orthodox and you need to be evangelical. Those are foundation pieces that have to be in place. Then you can move on to this second column that I've got on the right, where you think about things that are more distinctive to Baptists. And let me say a few words about these 2 central principles, and then I'll fill them in. One thing that's key to note, all of the Baptist distinctives, if you stop misusing like the acronym and put biblical authority in there, if you stop doing that kind of a thing, and you talk about the things that truly are distinct to Baptist identity, all of them are ecclesiological in nature. What makes someone Baptist is that they move beyond just a broad Protestantism to specific ecclesiological distinctions. And that's what happened historically. There's a wonderful, I don't think I put this article on our list. Kara was trying to build such a great bibliography, and I just realized I think I forgot one. James Renihan, I don't know how to pronounce his name. I think it's Renihan. He writes a lot on the early Baptists, the 17th century, massive commentary on the 1689 Confession, massive commentary on the First London Confession. He was part of a roundtable in the Journal of Baptist Studies years ago where they asked people from all 3 different views of Baptist origins to write an article, give us one defending Baptist successionism. I think they looked very long and hard before they finally found what might be the only scholar to have ever defended that position in a scholarly journal, James Duval. Then they asked someone to defend the Anabaptist origins view. And then they asked Renihan to defend the English separatist view. One of the things he lays out there, and he's a master of the 17th century literature, just an absolute master of it. He shows that Baptist identified themselves as Protestants. And you mentioned already that, the Second London Confession, even in its title pages, we're not Anabaptist. We're part of this broader Protestant movement. They were very, very clear in their self-identity that they were Protestant. But what they saw themselves as were Protestants who were carrying the principle of Reformation beyond its original loci or loci, however you want to pronounce it. They were carrying it to a new issue, ecclesiology. They were saying the Reformation has helped us reform our view of biblical authority, right, as we've returned to sola scriptura, and has helped us reform our view of soteriology as we've come back to justification by faith alone. All the Protestant reformers agree with that. They were saying, let's carry the Reformation a step further so that we also reframe how we think about the church. Let's take that doctrine back to the Bible and reframe it in light of the Bible. So they were reforming ecclesiology around biblical authority, and that's what led to the development of Baptist identity. That's what led to the development of the Baptist distinctives. And that starts really with these two central principles: regenerate church membership, congregational church polity. And I should note, some people identify one or the other of those as most important, and some people add a few others. Most, I think, would identify these two essentials. So let me kind of spell out what I mean by both of those. We've talked about all this a little bit already, but let me lay just real quickly a little bit of biblical grounding. First, the idea of a regenerate church membership. Fundamental to Baptist identity. Doesn't mean Baptists are the only one who hold to it, but it's fundamental to Baptist identity. Just think briefly, I'll just give two biblical arguments for it. There's many more that could be had in some of the works we've mentioned, like Allison's. First, in the New Testament, we see loads of local churches, not just where an author will address the universal church, but we'll talk to specifically often a particular local congregation. But think of how he often describes them. Paul will describe the local church. He writes to the church of God, which is at Corinth, right? He's writing to a particular local body, and he identifies them as sanctified. Or later to the Ephesians, he identifies them as saints or faithful brethren. There seems to be no concept in the use of those terms that he's writing to a mixed congregation. Some are believers, some are not. He seems to assume that if he writes to a local church, he recognizes there might be false professors there, right? He recognizes that some people will need to fall under discipline because they may be pretending to be believers that aren't. Like Jesus would say, many say to me in that day, Lord, Lord, have we not prophesied in their names? There's people that can appear to believe believers, but then later step away from the faith. And John says they went out from us that they might be made manifest, that they were not of us. That reality is always reckoned. But the idea is that in the church that he's writing to, those that are genuinely a member of that church are regenerate. I think there's a strong argument there to say Paul had no conception of a New Testament church that was made up partly of unbelievers and partly of believers. Even though much of church history has thought about ecclesiology that way, from Augustine and others on, I think the biblical grounding would say, actually, the church is made up of regenerate believers. Let me mention another passage that I think gives us solid grounding. And this passage, by the way, I'll mention another book, a marvelous book written by a whole bunch of different authors. A bunch of them have been my teachers. It's on Baptist distinctives / Baptist ecclesiology. The chapter by Steve Wellum, who was a professor of mine, worth the price of the book. It's him defending a regenerate church membership and congregational church polity from the Bible. He does a marvelous job. I won't share his whole arguments, but let me just mention one. If you go back to Jeremiah 31, you could also do this in Ezekiel. There's a number of places in the Old Testament where there's prophecy made about the new covenant, right? The new covenant that God's going to make with his people. One of the clearest that's picked up at a number of places in the New Testament is Jeremiah 31. I'm not going to read the whole long passage, but let me mention a few things from it. As God speaks through the prophet Jeremiah, he says, "Behold, the days come, saith the Lord, that I will make a new covenant." He's prophesying new covenant, the new covenant. We talk about a new covenant church or a New Testament church. He's prophesying this hundreds of years before it comes. Here's what the new covenant's going to look like. "I will put my law in their inward parts and write it in their hearts, and I will be their God, and they shall be my people." And in the section that I've left out there, he talks about how you guys keep breaking the old covenant, the covenant I made with you. You guys keep breaking it right and left. But here's this new covenant. Here's what's going to mark it. "And they shall teach no more." I will be their God, and they shall be my people. Who? All of them. "And they shall teach no more every man his neighbor and every man his brother, saying, Know the Lord. For they shall all know me, from the least unto the greatest of them, saith the Lord." Now, there's a really clear distinction being built here between an old covenant community and what he's prophesying, what Jeremiah is prophesying is the new covenant community. In the old covenant community, there's a mixed assembly. The old covenant with national Israel is made with a national body. You come into that covenant right after you're born. You get circumcised on the 8th day, and now you're a part of national Israel. You're a part of this covenanted people with God. But you may or may not be regenerate. You may or may not be a believer. And in fact, if you look at the history of the Old Testament people of God, you find loads and loads of people, maybe more unbelievers than there are believers, maybe more unfaithful than there are faithful, right? Just constant stories of them exercising unbelief. And that's so much the case that, as Jeremiah describes it, he kind of has this image there in the Old Covenant. People have to try to convert their Israelite neighbors. You have to go up to your Israelite neighbor and say, hey, you should know the Lord. Like, I need to teach you about the Lord. You don't know the Lord, but let me introduce you to him. That's the Old Covenant. But Jeremiah says there's going to be a shift in the New Covenant. In the New Covenant, there'll no longer be a need for covenant members to evangelize other covenant members, because every one of them will be regenerate. Every one of them will be a believer. He goes on and says, I'll put a new heart in them, my people, and I'll regenerate them. I'll restore them. I'm paraphrasing a little bit. I'll give them the new birth and the new life. And it applies not just to some of them, like a small remnant. We think in Old Testament theology, and you hear very often throughout the Old Testament, this idea of a remnant, right? There's this big covenant people of God, but then within it, there's a remnant that are actually faithful, that are actually believing, that actually know the Lord. And then there's all these, the Ahabs and all the wicked monarchs that disobey, and then the small regenerate. Jeremiah says, in the new covenant, that won't be the case. In the new covenant, they all know me. In the new covenant, they're all believers. In the new covenant, there's no need for them to evangelize one another. So I think there's clear precedent there for the idea that in the New Testament church, in the Old Covenant, there's a mixed assembly. Yes, there's unbelievers and believers together in the same covenant. You get into the covenant as a child when you're baptized. Whether you choose to follow the Lord, know him, and be regenerate or not is entirely up to you, and you may not. So there's a mixed assembly. In the New Covenant, that's not the case. In the New Covenant, everyone who's a part of the covenant is regenerate. That's what puts them into the covenant, right? Baptism becomes the entrance to the church. This is really key in the distinction between how covenant theologians have often framed baptism as corresponding to circumcision. One of the strongest arguments that Protestants have made for infant baptism is to say, well, in the Old Testament, you got brought into the covenant as an infant before you were old enough to understand, before you were old enough to believe. So likewise, they say in the New Testament church, we should baptize you as an infant, and that puts you into the covenant. You may be an unbeliever in the covenant, but you're in the covenant community. And then later, you'll hear the gospel, you'll hopefully respond and become a believer. I think that's fundamentally at odds with what Jeremiah is prophesying here, and with what Paul and other New Testament authors understand the new covenant to be. I think in the new covenant, you have only regenerate members, only believers. And anyone who's not a believer is not part of the covenant, which is why we don't baptize them into it as infants. We baptize after they've believed, which becomes a seal or a sign of their membership in the covenant. So that's just some brief soundings of biblical history about regenerate church membership. I'll spell out a few things that flow from that in a minute, but now let me move to that second one. I mentioned there's kind of two core principles: regenerate church membership, congregational church policy. Let me explain what congregational policy is. We've kind of talked about this already, but let me kind of lay it out as distinct from other policies. Most of church history has exercised episcopal church government. And you can see on the screen here, I've taken this chart from Michael Bird's Evangelical Theology. By the way, I love Bird's Evangelical Theology. It's my favorite evangelical theology. Bird is an Anglican. I disagree with his ecclesiology completely, but he does a marvelous job laying out each view. So in an episcopal church government, you have archbishops. In England, you have two archbishops, Canterbury and York. Then under them, you have bishops and archbishops over a whole province, thousands and thousands of churches. A bishop is usually over a diocese where he has hundreds of churches, sometimes 1,000 or 2,000. And underneath the bishop are individual rectors or priests who are over local particular parish churches. So your local church in the parish is actually run just by the priest, the day-to-day duties, but it's subject to a bishop who's over a whole bunch of churches, who's subject to an archbishop who's over all of it. The Archbishop of Canterbury actually is the primate of all England over all of it. So that basic structure, with some modifications, was the most common structure in church history, and it's still incredibly common among churches today. Some slight modification, it's how Roman Catholicism works. An episcopal structure is how Eastern Orthodoxy works. It's how many Protestant groups works, Episcopalians, Anglicans, so on. That's episcopal church government in a nutshell. Within the Reformation, many of the reformers, as they broke away, they began to develop slightly different ecclesiological convictions that came to its fullest expression among the Puritans, who developed a Presbyterian church government. I would say they started to reform ecclesiology, but they didn't get far enough. In a Presbyterian church government, you can see at the bottom, you have local individual congregations, Over each congregation is a group that's known as a session, which is made up of two types of elders, teaching elders and ruling elders. And there's always a sort of a body of them. But that local congregation doesn't have its own unique individual authority because they are in turn subject to a presbytery, which is a group of elders from a collection of different local congregations. Sessions come together to form a presbytery, and then they are in turn submitted to a synod. So there's not congregational authority in those two models. There are external bodies of belief, or sometimes external individuals like a pope, who stand over various individual churches. I think, in turn, a Baptist identity, and I think a biblical ecclesiology, recognizes the core principle of congregational church government. Again, defended at length in some of these other works by Allison or this work. I'm not going to go into a lengthy description, but let me give just some brief biblical soundings. First, notice in Matthew chapter 18, as Jesus gives instruction about church discipline. Famous passage where he first lays out the idea that if you have aught against your brother, if there's some serious sin, some serious offense between you, you go and talk to your brother alone. If that doesn't resolve the issue, he doesn't repent, you take someone else with you, take two people with you, etc. But then the final step of that process is really key, and it reveals to us a sort of a doctrine of church authority. I don't want to call it a doctrine of church authority like it's spelled out in detail. It hints towards the idea of where church authority lies. Look at what Jesus says. If he shall neglect to hear them, tell it unto the church. He didn't hear the one-on-one or the two-on-one meeting, so take it now to the church. But if he neglect to hear the church, then let him be unto thee as an heathen man and a publican. So that's the final move of what we call church discipline. They're excommunicated now from the body, treated as an unbeliever. That phrase, heathen and a publican, is a way of saying treat them as though they were an unbeliever. Now, ultimately, we're hoping that they're not an unbeliever and that this brings them back into the fold. But because they're behaving like an unbeliever and refuse to repent, we're going to treat them that way. Who makes that authoritative determination? It's not the individual. It is not the pastor. Jesus does not say, go find your pastor and he will decide whether to church that person. If your pastor churches people, you are not a Baptist church, no matter what you put on your sign. Your pastor doesn't have the right to church people. He doesn't have the right to remove people. Jesus is very clear. This comes to the church body. The church as a group has that authority. And then the church tells that person to repent. And notice Jesus says, if he doesn't hear them, it's only because he doesn't submit to the church's authority, the authority of the church body, that he's now excommunicated. So there's a vision there, I think, of congregational polity. Secondly, notice another excommunication case. Paul, in 1 Corinthians 5, he takes up the issue of a man who apparently is sleeping with his stepmother. But the oddest thing happens. Paul doesn't address that person and say, what a sinner, you need to stop that. Instead, he addresses the church body because he views there as being ultimately a big problem going on in the church body that should have been exercising authority over this individual. And he complains to the church, why aren't you guys dealing with this? Well, he writes in 2 Corinthians, really it's probably 3rd or 4th Corinthians because we have a couple letters that didn't make it into our canon. But he writes, and I think refers back to this situation. It may not be the same situation, but I think it is. Most scholars think it is. Even if it's not, the principle remains the same. He talks about a case of excommunication, probably that man, maybe someone else. And here's how he describes it. He says, sufficient to such a man is this punishment or censure, which was inflicted of many. And that's an articular, the adjective is articular and plural. It's functioning as a substantival, the many. In fact, in that sense, Bagdi or BDAG says that probably it means the majority. So who kicked this person out of the church? It wasn't a pastor. It wasn't one individual that he offended. It wasn't even an apostle. Paul says in 1 Corinthians 5, I give my judgment. Here's what you guys should do. But Paul doesn't do it. Paul doesn't kick the person out. He says, you need to do that. You're the church body. The congregation has that authority. They're the ones that are exercising under Christ, who is the head of the church, representing what Christ's will is. They're the ones responsible to kick this body out. And here we have an instance where the man's been kicked out. Who did it? It wasn't Paul. It wasn't an apostle. It wasn't a particular pastor or an offended individual. It was the church body. And probably, I think there's a hint that there was a majority vote. I think the phrase they use kind of means there was a vote. It carried a majority, and the majority decided this person should be excommunicated. And that's where the authority for excommunication in Paul's mind lies, which means the authority of the congregation lies with the body. One last mention. In the very important case in Acts chapter 15, where there's a division in the church and they have to take up what should be required of Gentiles, James speaks, the apostles speak, but when they make the ultimate decision, look at how Luke describes that decision. Then pleased it the apostles and elders with the whole church to send chosen men of their own company to Antioch with Paul and Barnabas. And then he goes on to list the men and the message they're supposed to carry. Even in the midst of a massive church council where apostles are coming and sharing their ideas, sharing their voices, there's debates. Obviously, there's discussion that takes place. But where does the locus of authority lie? I think for Luke, it lies with the local congregation. So there's much, much more that we could say there. But I think those are some biblical soundings that give us an idea that from a New Testament pattern, church authority doesn't lie with an individual. It doesn't lie with a pastor. It doesn't even lie with an apostle, although we don't have today apostles in the same sense, I think, that we find in the New Testament. But there's church authority that belongs in the body. So let me mention a couple of different ways that this is spelled out. These come from Wayne Grudem's Systematic Theology. He actually lists like 6 different forms of congregational church government. I'm just going to mention the 2 that I think are most common, probably by far most common. On the left is what's called the single elder-led congregation. You have a pastor over a group of deacons who make a deacon board over a congregation. In some of those churches, the deacons don't function. In fact, many of those churches, the deacons don't function in an administrative or authoritative capacity. So it's just pastor over the congregation. But notice, as Grudem's drawn the little line on the left, the pastor leads the congregation, but the congregation is actually over the pastor. The pastor in a Baptist church polity, in congregational church polity, the pastor must be submitted to the congregation. And again, if you're in a church where that's not the case, and I think this is happening in a lot of Baptist churches today, they've taken that single elder model, they've begun to develop stronger and stronger pastoral authority, and they end up with a pastor over the congregation, and the pastor's submitted to no one. And what often happens is they'll build from old covenant teaching. They'll go back and say, oh, well, God had Moses, who was over the people of God. God had the prophet that he sent. The prophets exercised authority. God had individual priests. But they don't realize, what did Jeremiah say? There's a fundamental shift between the old covenant and the new covenant. Certainly there's continuity there, and there's a big debate about how much continuity, how much discontinuity. But there's also a fundamental shift between the old covenant people of God and the new covenant people of God. In the old covenant people of God, you do have human mediators. You have priests. You have prophets. You have monarchs and kings. That's not a new covenant model. And you should get really nervous if your pastor is trying to emphasize his authority by pointing to those models as though he were a Moses. Your pastor is not Moses. And if I can speak real bluntly, your pastor is not the Apostle Paul. And if your pastor is presenting himself as though he has that kind of authority without any congregational oversight over him, you may be in a church that's great. That's fine. There's lots of denominations that hold that view. That's been a common view through church history, but you are really not in a Baptist church.
Yeah.
I mean, also, I'll just say it bluntly. You're not in a Baptist church.
Yeah. This is interesting because whenever you talk about the congregational church governance and the congregation having the ultimate authority and things like that, you mentioned the idea of of priests. And I think this kind of comes back to when you have a proper understanding of the congregationalism, out from that flows the idea that we talked about earlier of priesthood of all believers.
Yes.
And so this is where this comes from, is it's not endowed to a single person that runs the whole thing or to a select few at the top that then it disseminates down through. It's the priesthood of all the believers. All of them have a role to play in their service in the church, and pastor and elder is one of those. Of many. They hold a particular position that does carry more weight and authority in certain areas.
Sure.
Absolutely. But you elect them to that, to represent you in those areas. But you also have people that you should be serving in other areas and capacities. I kind of like the idea of some churches, whenever they talk about their, they don't just talk about their pastor and assistant pastor and youth pastor, but they also talk about like a music pastor in that sense, or they talk about their media pastor or things like that. They use those terms. Sometimes they do it as a kind of in a joking manner, but in some ways they're recognizing that, look, there are people that are put in positions of leadership, and the pastor, the teaching pastor, the preaching pastor in that sense is guiding and leading all the elements that are involved in the teaching of doctrine and theology. But it does not mean that he is the end all be all and the final say on everything.
Yeah, that's
and
right.
So I think that a proper understanding of congregationalism, and out of that's built on actually a theology of priesthood of all believers.
That's right. So, and again, there's this idea, if someone's appealing to the idea of, oh, well, I can be a single leader over the people because there were priests in the Old Testament, or I can be a single leader over God's people Just think of the kings like David in the Old Testament. But what does Peter say in 1 Peter? And I'm not going to misquote it. I don't have it in front of me. He says, you're an elect people. You're a holy people, a royal nation, a kingdom of priests, right? Like he says, as believers, every one of you is now a king. Every one of you is now a priest. Every one of you is now royal. This isn't just one man who's got royal blood in him now that's chosen by God to lead. You all have that function, which doesn't mean there's not leadership in the New Testament church, in the New Covenant. There is, but that leadership's fundamentally transformed from the Old Covenant model. So I've got like 2 on the screen here. There are a half a dozen different ways that you can lay this out. Grudem goes into a lot more detail. In the single elder model, you do still have one pastor who's leading the congregation. But if it's a genuinely congregational church, following a Baptist model, then the congregation is also over the one leader. I think a much more biblical expression of covenantal polity is a multiple elder-led church. And this has become more and more common. Mark Dever's written a lot from Capitol Hill Baptist Church in Washington to show that this is actually the original Baptist model. This is what early Baptists held to. But for the last couple hundred years, maybe for the last 150 years, the single elder model has been really the most common way that Baptist churches have been structured. That's starting to change as more and more people are looking back towards their roots in history, and I think looking back towards the Bible. In a multiple elder-led congregation, like I said, you might have 4 or 5 different people who are called pastor, and no particular one of them is necessarily in charge of the whole group, but rather there's a body of them. You see those E's there in Grudem's diagram, that means elder. He's identified one of them as pastor. So you may have someone that's called senior pastor, or head pastor, lead pastor. I don't even like that terminology. I really like the idea of all of them being on par. But the idea is there's never just one. There are other people, and the elders are accountable to each other. And then again, you can see that little thing on the left. All of the congregation still stands in authority over the elders.
Yeah.
So whether you've got a single elder or multiple elders, you're only a congregational church. You're only a Baptist church if the congregation is in authority over that pastor or pastors. Yeah. If you don't have that, you're not a congregational body. I could mention a lot in defense of multiple elders. I'm really passionate about it, but let me just mention one quick verse.
Yeah, go for it.
In Acts 14:23, as the apostolic team is traveling around and planting churches, there's this wonderful phrase where Luke says, they ordained them elders, plural, in every or each church. So as they were going from church to church, even when you're talking about a tiny little church plant, sometimes it's just a couple people, it seems that it was very important to the apostolic team to say, we're not leaving this church with just one person in charge. They seem to be really opposed to that idea. So in Luke's specific, in every church they planted on that journey, they made sure there were multiple elders. And I think you could show across the entire New Testament, there is never an instance where elders are spoken of as though there's one elder in charge. It's always in the plural.
Even in the pastoral epistles, you get the indications of that as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
People sometimes will quote from the list in the pastoral epistles, the qualifications for a bishop, the bishop singular. But the grammatical function that's probably being used there is the monadic, the idea that representatively, this is what a bishop should be. Not that every church should have one bishop, because what does Paul tell Timothy? Ordain elders, plural, in every city. So again, even there, I think it's across the New Testament, the idea of multiple elders. That's a whole other conversation. Right. You can still be a Baptist and not believe in multiple elders, but I do think it's the most biblical expression of congregationalism.
And I think you can even if you held the multiple elders thing, I think there's still a case to be made that the teaching pastor, the teaching elder, would in some ways carry a little bit more weight than some of the others, because the teaching element of doctrine and theology is pervasive through every element of the function of the church. And so if you've elected them to be guiding that and guarding that, then they're going to have their hands in virtually everything for that reason. And so I think there's a case to be made that, the teaching elder, the pastor, if you, depending on how you want to define it, but is going to carry a little bit more weight and authority that you've elected them to. But it does not mean that they don't answer to anybody else.
Right. And, so, that's the key thing. And I would prefer such a situation, like if I were designing a church from scratch, and I've been a part of church plants, and actually this was the way we were setting it up. Although I didn't stick around with that church plant. I came back to another church later after a year or two. But like if I had my rathers, so to speak, as the Southerners would say, I would establish a complete parity of the elders. I don't like the idea of one having more authority, but it is really natural in a congregation, especially if you have one doing most of the preaching, that a particular individual will have more influence. I don't have a problem with that so far as when it comes to authority, they're still equal to the other elders. The other elder, in other words, they have to have accountability to the other elders, I think, or there's some serious problems that develop. And this happens so often where there are scandals in congregational churches, independent churches that are not connected to another body, but have kind of taken this single elder model and turned it into a non-congregational church where that one man's in charge. And it seems like every other day we read about a new sex scandal or financial scandal. And not always, it can happen in any church model, but very, very commonly it happens in models where there's one man in charge and he's not accountable to the whole body anymore. Even if the church calls itself a Baptist church or a congregational church, they're not functioning that way. And so because that man is no longer accountable to the church body and he's not accountable to any other elders, all kinds of abuses can happen. Now, hear me carefully. I am not saying that if you're in a single elder congregation, your pastor is being abusive. I don't know that. He may be a completely faithful pastor. And I'm not saying that non-congregational forms of church government are inherently abusive, whether that's an Episcopal or a Presbyterian form. In fact, Presbyterians have usually been really good at checking abuse because of all the checks and balances that they have in place. But I am saying that if you're in a single elder-led congregation and your pastor's no longer submitted to the congregation, you're definitely not in a Baptist church anymore. And I think you're in a situation where that's not to say your pastor is a dictator. It's not to say your pastor is abusive, but you've opened up the door for that to happen very, very easily. And unfortunately, that story has been replayed hundreds and hundreds of times over. It happens all too commonly. I think a biblical model is for that pastor to be submitted to the congregation's authority. Again, Jesus said, take it to the church, not take it to the one pastor, right? You know who gets to kick out your pastor? The church body. Yeah. If he's living not in accordance with orthodoxy or not in accordance with the pure life, he doesn't just get to do what he wants to do. And I've been in churches where this kind of thing has happened. I won't name the church, but I was an intern at a church for a while, in a totally different state, totally different part of America. And that pastor eventually ran off with his secretary. And basically, as the church, I wasn't there when this happened, but as that developed and took place, the church couldn't tell him what to do because they had set up a model where he was a graduate from Hyles-Anderson. And the church had set up a model where kind of a Moses mentality. He's the one man in charge. He can do whatever he wants. So he basically told them, you can't tell me not to do this. I can do whatever I want. And that I'm not saying that's going to happen every time, but it can happen all too easily. And I think a biblical model says that the eldership is actually submitted to the congregation.
Yeah. And also with those models, you end up with these churches where the pastor runs and does everything, and it's a staff-led, staff-run church, and then the congregation just shows up and consumes and leaves. And so it's actually really damaging to the body of the church. And that's why this concept of the priesthood of the believer is actually a damaging misrepresentation of the actual theological position. There is that it's priesthood of all believers, and everyone has a role to play. And it's not that the pastor has the only role to play, or the staff has the only role to play. It's that you all do. And when you elect certain people to represent certain ministry areas, that's going to necessarily carry more weight and more responsibility and things like that. But it doesn't mean that it carries more authority in the sense that they are unaccountable.
Right.
I mean, I don't want people to mishear me. It does carry authority because you've elected them to hold that authority.
Right. Yeah. Church elders have authority. The Bible is very clear about that.
Right. And I mean, it's kind of like whenever you elect people to government, they do carry authority. They have authority to make decisions and to, in some sense, direct things, but they're still accountable to the people. And so
that's right.
It's same sort of concept.
Along those lines, the next slide I wanted to show here is exactly what you're just saying. So these images here, they come from an excellent article. I would list this as one of my top 2 or 3 must reads if you're thinking about the church and what the New Testament teaches about the church and the New Testament church model. It's an excellent little article from Gordon Fee. It's actually been republished in half a dozen different collections of his writing. It's called Laos and Leadership. And he walks through the biblical data and kind of shows how the New Testament conceives of church leaders and their relationship to the congregation. And he was a Pentecostal in the Assemblies of God, so a congregational setting, not a Baptist setting, but a congregational setting, arguing for a congregational church polity. But he was less interested in the denominational issues. He was just interested in, if we come to the New Testament, what does it tell us about how the church should be structured? And he says, well, one of the problems is very little. The Bible doesn't spell out in detail how we should structure our churches. If you think of soteriology, the Bible goes through great detail about how those doctrines should work out. When it comes to how the church should be structured, the Bible is not as explicit. But that doesn't mean the Bible doesn't have anything to say. If we think in terms of New Testament theology and the New Testament people of God as the New Covenant eschatological people of God, there are certainly things to say. So he says, basically, if we look through church history, the most common way churches have been structured is this image that you see on the left, where there's a sharp division between clergy and laity. And again, it comes back to that priest idea where, we have a certain group of people that are ordained to the ministry, so they're the priest, and then the rest of us are just lay people. Usually a sacerdotalism, but it doesn't always express itself that way, but a sharp clergy-laity distinction. But as Fee goes, and I'm not going to show all his argument, you can read the article for yourself. There's a few places where you can read it free that I'll put in the links. Take some time to read it. It's well worth reading. As he shows in the New Covenant, in the New Testament, the idea of church model knows absolutely nothing of a clergy-laity distinction. That is an old covenant model where you do have particularly ordained priests that serve over the quote-unquote lay people. Like that is there in the Bible. It's in the Old Covenant, but it is not in the New Testament. In the New Testament, all believers are priests. So there's no longer a clergy-laity distinction at all. So instead what you have is, he draws this one big circle, the body of Christ. All of you are part of the same body. All of you are subject to the same rules. That doesn't mean there's not still leadership. There is. The Bible's really clear about elders having leadership and the people of God being submitted to the elders of the church. But as he redraws it, instead of clergy being a separate circle that's over laity, it's leaders and people all within the one body of Christ, all subject to one another. And those leaders do lead. They do have authority, but they're leading from within the body of Christ. So he has this concluding statement where he says, leadership in the New Testament people of God is never seen as outside or above the people themselves, which is exactly what you were saying earlier, but simply as part of the whole, essential to its well-being, but governed by the same set of rules. I think it's a very, very important shift in the way we think about ecclesiology and the shift from the Old Covenant to the New Covenant. And I think if we get that wrong, I guarantee you if we get that wrong, we won't really be congregational. And I would argue that then that means we really aren't even Baptist anymore.
Right.
So let me kind of come back and summarize. I know we've talked about a whole bunch of different things. I'm arguing there are really two sets of beliefs when we talk about Baptist identity. We really need to keep two sets of beliefs together. On the one hand are prerequisites, because you have to be a Christian before you can be a Baptist. So prerequisites of orthodoxy, prerequisites of evangelicalism. I don't think we should leave those things unsaid. Then there are Baptist principles, what we usually call Baptist distinctives. They're really all ecclesiological in nature. Once you sort out the things that I think sometimes get put on the list that shouldn't be put on the list. What makes us Baptist distinctly is our ecclesiology. I would argue there's two core principles, regenerate church membership and congregational church polity. And from those flow the other things that we often identify as Baptist distinctives. So let me list a couple. You could add to this list. You could tweak it a little bit. This is just the way I've laid it out. But I think there's good cause for it. So from the idea of regenerate church membership flows the idea of believers' baptism. Maybe you could add immersion, maybe not. Again, I don't like to. Some people might. But the idea is the whole reason we practice believers' baptism is because that's what safeguards a regenerate church. In the Old Covenant, you've got people circumcised on the 8th day joining the covenant. In the New Covenant, we're saying, no, only believers are welcome into this covenant. Baptism's the seal and sign of that covenant, so we're only going to baptize those that are believers. It's a way of protecting regenerate church membership. And theologically, it flows out of regenerate church membership. I think the next principle that's been always a mark of Baptist distinctives also flows from that, the idea of a church-state separation. Again, not a sharp divorcing where Christians can't have anything to do with the government, but a recognition of two totally separate spheres. The church has no business telling the church doesn't run the state, and the state has no business telling the church what to do. That flows out of the idea of a regenerate church membership. If the church and the state are exactly the same, then the state becomes the tool by which the church is run, which is how much of church history has looked. The state enforces religious dogmas. But the Baptist came along, especially Thomas Helwys initially in his little book, The Mystery of Iniquity in 1612. He writes it to King James, the same King James that commissions the King James Bible, King James I. And he writes it to him and he dedicates it. We actually still have the copy with his handwritten note in the front of it, where he basically tells King James, you have no business telling people what to believe. This is a matter of conscience between individuals and Jesus. Whether there's I can't quote it exactly. I should have put it on a slide. There's this famous statement where it says, it doesn't matter if they're a Turk or a Jew or a Christian or whatever they believe. You have no business using the sword to compel them. The only sword that should compel them is the spiritual sword of Scripture. You can try to persuade them and convince them, but you have no business coercing them. Classic statement of church-state separation. But for hell where does it flow from? It flows from that initial theology of regenerate church membership. Many people have said that church-state separation has been the greatest contribution of Baptist theology to the world. And I think that's very fair. In our modern...
Yeah, I was going to say, could you flesh out a little bit, how is it that church-state separation is connected with regenerate church membership specifically?
Yeah. So in the model before the Baptists arise, or really before the Anabaptists arise, you are a member of the state by virtue of being a member of the church.
That's right.
You're baptized as an infant, and when you're baptized, the state essentially equals the church, so now you're made a member of the state at the same time as you're made a member of the church. So the church is run by and dictated by, and there's lots of good godly men who have held this view, by the way. Love Calvin to death, right? Love Luther to death, love the reformers and the way they were thinking. But they tended to view the state then as a tool that would enforce religious orthodoxy, which is why they were fine with people being persecuted. They were fine with people being thrown in prison who were heretics. Luther was fine signing on, and Calvin was fine signing on to the, I just went blank on the famous execution case, Michael Servetus. Sign on the dotted line. Let the guy die. Why? Because the state's enforcing religious views. And Calvin took that view, I think, to an extreme in Calvinist Geneva. It's kind of known as being really dogmatic in the rules that it laid out for the citizens. I mean, there were legal fines and penalties if you didn't go to church every Sunday, if you didn't baptize your children, if you were caught drinking, like things that we would normally think of as civil issues, they were all religious issues. And the church runs the state, and the state is the church, because church and state are so closely connected. It was initially the Anabaptists that started to pull those things apart, and then I think it comes to its fullest expression in the Baptists when they recognized, no, actually, church and state are two entirely different spheres. You come into the state by being a member of the state, and yes, you're subjugated to the state's laws. That's something that God does. Again, the Anabaptists don't think so. The Anabaptists are more prone to say that's just the worldly system, stay away from it. But among the Baptists, they recognize, the state's, the instrument of God to punish evildoers, but has nothing to do with religion. Now, religion is a separate sphere.
Yeah, I could see somebody pushing back on this a little bit and saying, why would this be a Baptist distinctive today? I could see it being a big deal then, but today that's not really a concern, especially in America. Virtually every church holds to some version of separation.
Exactly, but that is the thing that I think should be recognized historically, and a number of the people who have written on Baptist distinctives, to go back to, I forget what I did with Stan Norman's book, one of the things he points out and argues, that's the case today. Today, virtually all of America and most of the Western world holds to some form of religious liberty. Not all of them, but most hold to some form of religious liberty. Certainly in America, we have this well-defined sense of separation of church and state. Sometimes the political doctrine of church and state gets misused to essentially mean a secular society, almost the opposite of what it originally meant, a secular society that suppresses the church. That has happened in terms of legal jurisprudence sometimes as well. I don't think that's a good understanding of constitutional law, but that's a whole other issue. But here's the point that Norman and others are making. That's the standard American view today. You know why? Because of the Baptist. That is the legacy that Baptist left to American polity. Baptists developed that idea. They were the first to really fully articulate that understanding of a clear distinction and separation of church and state in their separate spheres, influenced by the idea of regenerate church membership, because they're pulling apart baptism and membership in the state. And as they make that separation and pull the two apart, that's what leads to those classic statements of political understanding of separation of church and state. Jefferson's letter to the Danbury Baptist Association, for example, where that's not the first time the phrase is used, but it's the usage of the phrase that made its way into various legal precedents. Where does it come from? Well, it comes from his letter to the Baptists, and it's developed from a Baptist view. So I would say that what has become just standard today in America has become standard because of the Baptist.
Yeah.
It's a key part of our heritage, a key part of our identity, and it has been, many historians would say, and I agree, our sort of greatest political gift to the Western world. But let's still own it. It's a part of Baptist identity, right? Like we developed it. We were the ones that thought through this and said, hey, this is how biblical ecclesiology leads toward an understanding of the state.
Yeah, so you're saying we leave it in there as a Baptist, like a Baptist principle, because the Baptists were the ones who pioneered this idea, and the very fact that it is no longer much of an issue is not a knock against it being on the list of Baptist distinctives, but in fact, we need to recognize that every other church has just become more Baptistic in that
Right.
particular area.
That's a good way to put it. Yeah.
It doesn't mean that it's like not a Baptist distinctive. It just means that everybody else has come along finally.
Yeah. In other words, it's been really our most influential Baptist distinctive. Where we have most shaped politics. And again, that's not to say if we speak broadly of religious freedom, there are other conceptions of religious freedom that have existed, especially in the Netherlands and then among the Anabaptists. But the specific idea of a separation of church and state, that's a Baptist gift to the world.
Yeah, especially today, in the United States. Yeah.
Especially and in the United States, it comes through initially Roger Williams, who establishes the first Baptist church in Providence, Rhode Island. And it gets picked up in our legal language because of the Baptist. It is because of Baptist theology that America today has a well-defined, robust political ideology of a separation of church and state. Again, one that sometimes gets misused in different ways.
Right.
But that's a gift from the Baptists. It's a core part of our Baptist identity, and it flows directly out of a theology of regenerate church membership. And I think we should hold on to it. So as we think through these Baptist principles,
and then out of that flows the next one, which is soul liberty.
That's right. So. Yeah. If we think of church, again, there's like 6 or 7 different ideas that are sometimes distinguished and separated, sometimes lumped together as one. I'm lumping them into 2, but you could arrange these differently. If we think of church-state separation as there's no external state coercion on what I believe, soul liberty is that more individualistic understanding that's really what most people have meant when they've talked about priesthood of the believers. They're misusing priesthood of the believer as a doctrine, but what they're trying to say is there's no priest between me and God. I can immediately go to God. I can pray directly to Jesus. I don't have to have a human mediator, and therefore I'm responsible for what I believe. I'll stand before Jesus on the judgment day, and I won't be able to say, well, I believe this because my pastor taught it to me, so who cares if he was wrong or not? And I've had Baptists tell me that. When we've had theological discussions, I've had people tell me, well, my pastor taught it this way. If he was wrong, then that's just basically that's what I'll explain on Judgment Day. Well, I'm sorry. The Baptist doctrine of soul liberty says you're going to stand before Jesus as an individual someday, and you're going to give a response. You're going to be responsible and give an answer for what you've believed, how you've lived, etc. No one else will do that for you. There is no priest that will stand before you in Jesus. You're solely competent as a soul. You have soul liberty, and you individually will stand before God. I distinguish that from the church-state thing because one of them is more of a corporate, political, legal polity, and the other one I think is an understanding of the individual's competency. But again, there's a bunch of different ways to reframe those, and there's some overlap. I'm viewing them as 2 separate ones, but flowing out of regenerate church membership. So Baptist principles, we've got prerequisites. Once we've established those Baptist principles, 2 core principles, regenerate church membership. The second one, which we've talked about a lot, congregational polity. I think the other things that are identified as Baptist distinctives, they really all flow from that idea of congregational church polity. I've laid 3 here. Some people could add to this, tweak them a little bit. But first, that idea of local church autonomy. Well, theologically, where does autonomy come from? It comes from what the New Testament pattern gives us of that congregational polity that we've talked about. If the church body as a congregation is the authority that you go to for excommunication, the authority for church decisions, the authority for a massive decision like the Acts 15 proclamation and the sending of those that would share that message, if that's the case, the natural conclusion is that each local body is autonomous, which runs up against the grain of most of church history. Because most of church history, churches have been Episcopal in their format. And then from the Reformation, most of Reformed ecclesiology as it developed, especially among the Puritans, was Presbyterian in format, which is sort of a middle way. But really, if we look at the New Testament model, I think the New Testament model leads us towards congregational church polity. And once that's in place, that leads immediately to local church autonomy. That doesn't mean your church shouldn't have other connections. In fact, Baptist associationalism began almost within the first few years of Baptists existing. They started to associate in other groups. And for the first 100 years of General Baptists and Particular Baptists, lots of associations would connect different churches together. You need to be connected to other churches, and especially you need to be connected to the broader universal body of Christ. Recognize that there's other believers there. But in terms of how your church functions and runs, I think the biblical model is your church doesn't answer to anyone except Jesus. Jesus is the head of the church. What does Paul say over and over again in Colossians and Ephesians, right? Jesus is the head of the church, not a man, not an individual over here, certainly not another church body or a collection of elders from a group of different churches. Jesus is the head of the church, and his will's revealed in the congregation. So local church autonomy, core Baptist distinctive really flows from congregational church polity. Let me mention two others that aren't as common. You mentioned one of these earlier, and I wanted to circle back to it, and I was hoping we'd come back to it. Secondly, a covenanted membership. A covenanted membership. It flows directly out of the idea of a regenerate church. In fact, the first church to ever really be organized with a written confession, a written covenant rather, that bound them together, was the Smith and Helway's church. They covenanted to get together in a written covenant. Some people have argued that the Anabaptists had sort of an implied covenant, but they didn't write a covenant out and take an official covenant together as a church. That was innovated by the Baptist. And in fact, in most of the Baptist confessions of faith from very early on, whether you look at the first London Confession, the second London Confession, the really, really popular 1833 New Hampshire Confession, as they define the church, they'll usually say something along the lines of, the church is a congregation of covenanted believers. And the idea is we've entered together into a covenant as a church that binds us together as a body. Now, a confession of faith is, here's the church saying what it believes. A covenant is, here's a church saying how we're going to live in light of that. And so they enter into covenant together. That's really a Baptist innovation, and it's something that sadly has disappeared in a lot of Baptist churches. But I would argue, like you were saying earlier, you were talking about how your church had moved that direction. I think it's a core ecclesiological component that just flows naturally from congregational church polity. And I think we can clearly show in church history it was a part of Baptist church life in every age, in virtually every church. I think I mentioned earlier, there's a new work coming out by Timothy George. It's been common to talk about Baptist confessions. That's been pretty well treated in the literature. And I'll mention this is kind of the gold standard of them, William Lumpkin's second edition of just a massive collection of Baptist confessions, and he includes Anabaptist confessions. What hasn't been given as much attention is church covenants. But Timothy George's new book, whenever it comes out, I think is published with B&H, it's going to collect confessions, but also a whole massive collection of church covenants. And because churches have always been interested in training the next generation, a collection of church catechisms. So it puts all three together, confession, covenant, and catechism. I think it's important for us to think that way. And I can share kind of a personal story. You were sharing one earlier, which you maybe want to say more about here in just a second too, but let me share just a personal story. The church that I was a part of for about 10 years, it had been in existence for about 20 years when Sam Storms came at Bridgeway Church. So he had been there like 10 years before I was there. And he's not there now. The church has moved on, and we've moved on. Like I said, we've been visiting a Southern Baptist church that we'll probably join soon. And we kind of bounced around a little bit between that. But anyway, at Bridgeway, when they first started, they didn't have covenant membership. There was no covenant. There wasn't any specific membership. But I love what Sam did when he first came. He didn't exercise authority and say, this is the way we're going to do things. He recognized, I'm submitted to the body. And there's a very clearly established plurality of elders. That was how the church functioned and functions to this day. So he asked the elders, can I start to preach on why I think a covenant is biblical? And okay, the elders agreed. So he started to preach just started with the Bible, right? So let me preach the Bible about it. And he preached the Bible and eventually convinced the elders and eventually convinced the congregation. This flows naturally from the idea of a regenerate church membership. And it flows naturally from the idea of congregational church polity. We should adopt this. And then they adopted the idea of covenant and became a covenanted church. And now if you go and join a member, as I did when I was a member there, you have to enter this covenant with the elders. An elder comes, sits down and reads the covenant. You read your covenant. You are literally taking an oath to one another that you will behave in accordance with certain Christian standards. And it became an essential part of their membership. But I love the way it came about. It wasn't an individual telling everyone this is what they're going to do. Just preaching the Bible. Hey, can I preach the Bible and argue for this from the Bible? And it convinced an entire body and it convinced a group of elders. So I think it's a key part of Baptist church life. It's certainly been a key part of Baptist churches in history. Yeah. And you were sharing a little bit of your story about how it's been, I guess, a part of your church life.
And the vast majority of Baptist churches, I had never heard of this. The vast majority of Baptist churches don't practice this. And I think it is
today
really
we've lost it.
Yes. Yeah. And I had never heard of this idea until my pastor he preached on it as well. He was teaching through several years ago, teaching through ecclesiology and different elements like that. And he taught on the importance of a church covenant and kind of really challenged us like, hey, this is a really important thing, a historical thing. Why don't we do this? Like, why have we not done this? We should really consider this. And so he worked together with myself and several other people, and we wrote out what would be a church covenant that is almost exclusively just biblical text of what does the Bible say the church ought to be, and our relationship to each other should be, and that's it. And so we wrote that out, and we passed it out to everybody. And I don't remember if we voted on it or if it was adopted a little bit more organically. I can't remember exactly because it's been several years now. But
you were there as part of that process of adoption.
Yeah. And it wasn't just written by him. It was written by a collection of us that were working on it, and then he sent it out to everybody to look at and talk about and discuss and things like that. So, but now every member that comes in signs our doctrinal statement and our covenant, saying, "Hey, like you're aligning with us as a church." The statement that we say a lot is, "You're joining us. We're not joining you."
That's good.
And so they agree to our doctrinal statement, but then also they sign our covenant, and that's something that has been really important. And one of the things that we haven't pivoted to yet, but we're wanting to, is making our communion services, which we've been doing more and more and more. So we used to do it, I don't know, like most churches, like maybe once a year, and then we started doing it. Then we did it twice a year, and then we did it 3 times a year, and then we did it 4 times a year. And so this year we just did our 5th one this year.
Oh, that's awesome.
And then each year we're trying to do it more and more, because it's not a normal thing. Most people just rarely do it. And we want to make it, we want to do it on a more regular basis and still make it meaningful, and have that balance there. But one of the things we're wanting to do is implementing an element of the church covenant with that, so that when we do come to the Lord's table together, because it is a congregational thing, it's not an individualistic thing, that we read the church covenant together and we reaffirm our covenant to one another during the Lord's Supper. And so we haven't implemented that yet, but it's been in discussion for a little while, and we're just trying to think of the best way to go about that.
Oh, I love that. It used to be such a core part of Baptist life. You actually, 100 years ago, 200 years ago, 300 years ago, for centuries, it used to be the case that if you walked into a Baptist church, it was very, very common for the church covenant to be framed on the wall, because they recognize, hey, this is a document that we've constituted around. We've all read it, swore and agreed to it. It binds us together. And so they would just post it like on the wall. Today, you almost never find that.
Yeah,
and it's
really
it's an area where, Baptists have sort of gotten away from their historical roots.
Actually, I'm gonna write that down, because I want to mention that to our pastor. I think he would really like that idea. And
I think it's a great idea.
Discuss that.
And it certainly got precedence. It was very, very common in Baptist churches for at least 200 years. But today, I can't remember ever seeing it. I mean, I read about it in history books. I can't remember ever seeing it, because churches just don't today emphasize the covenant like they used to. But I think that's, like you said, I think that's an area where we've gotten away from our Baptist historical roots that we need to get back to. I think covenant's very, very valuable, especially when it comes to discipline, which is kind of the next one that I've listed there.
Yeah,
covenant gives you a basis for church discipline.
Right.
Which, again, we mentioned some texts like from Jesus and Paul. Church discipline clearly seems to flow from the idea of congregational church polity. The congregation is the authority. How do you go about enacting it? Well, the clearest, most obvious way to do that, to me, is the church covenant.
Yeah.
Because if there's a particular individual who has covenanted to live in a certain way and continues impenitently to sin in a way against that covenant, then you can just say, here's the covenant. You agreed to live X, Y, Z. You're not. You're either going to need to repent and come back to that way of living. All Christians sin. Sin's not a problem. Sin doesn't cause excommunication. Impenitence causes excommunication. Right. If you're not going to repent and come back to live under that covenant, then you're not part of this covenant body.
Yeah.
And that just flows directly into church discipline, which is also something that unfortunately churches have got away from, understandably, because it can be abused. It can be done in really awful, ugly, abusive ways, and that has happened. And that's unfortunate.
That's what
don't throw the baby out with the bathwater.
Yeah, that's what I was just getting ready to say, though, is that the covenant, it protects against that, because it gives you a precedent and a standard by which everybody's held.
Right.
And it's not just, well, this happened or I feel this way, and so certain people decide whatever. It's like, no. This church covenant that you agreed to is violated. And so in some sense, it's a contract on both ends, that there's a recognition by both parties that, hey, you have violated this and you're refusing to be repentant of it. And so, I agree. I think that's definitely important. Now, one thing I noticed was missing from your congregational church polity that we've talked a bunch about is the priesthood of all believers. Why didn't you decide to include that on there? Or maybe that was an oversight and you should.
No, I left it off intentionally because what most people mean by priesthood of believers, I think we've covered with soul liberty. And in terms of what is actually meant by priesthood of believers, again, I just don't think it's a Baptist distinctive. What I've listed here, these 8 items, I think they're Baptist distinctives. What I don't mean by that any one of them is not held by other groups. Every one of these 8 items that I've listed here as Baptist principles are held by at least several other Protestant groups. But I would argue that when you bring them all together, only Baptists hold all of these things.
Mm-hmm.
If you hold to all 8 of these things, you're a Baptist. But I don't think priesthood of the believers fits in that sort of ecclesiological framework. I don't think it's a Baptist distinctive at all. I think it's a Protestant distinctive. So if I put it anywhere, I would put it on that left side of the chart, if that makes sense, not in this Baptist principle side of the chart.
I'm curious as to what you say to this. I want to push back on that a little bit. I see your point. I see your perspective on that of it being a Protestant thing. But as we talked about just a little bit ago, if properly understood, priesthood of all believers directly impacts congregationalism and things like that, and the congregation having the authority rather than a set of priests and things like that. Is like you're supposed to hold them. It has to do with the covenant. You're all serving and being served. You're also holding each other accountable and being held accountable and teaching and being taught and things like that. And so it seems to kind of, when properly understood, fit directly into the congregational element.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly think it's consistent. I agree with you. If we say it seems completely consistent as a way to think about congregational church polity, absolutely. My thing is just that it's not distinctive of Baptist identity at all. So a lot of the things on that left side of the chart, like biblical authority, I would argue that biblical authority is the grounding for congregational church polity, right? Biblical authority is the grounding for regenerate church membership. And all those, I'm going back to these sort of broader prerequisites, but those broader prerequisites are held by all evangelicals. And I think priesthood of the believers, I mean, Luther develops it. Luther's the farthest thing from a Baptist, right? He's the first one to really flesh out, I think it's a New Testament idea, but he's the one to really first flesh out the idea of the priesthood of the believer as originally understood by the Reformers. So the Reformers are all holding to it. But if I were to put it on this chart, I'd put it on that left-hand side.
On the prerequisites.
Here's something that, so for example, I have there 2 categories: prerequisites of orthodoxy, prerequisites of evangelicalism. If I were to make a third section, prerequisites of Protestantism, I'd put it right there. Mm-hmm. Yeah, you can't be a Protestant if you don't hold to the priesthood of the believers. Right. So in a sense, it grounds much of what we call Baptist identity or Baptist distinctives, but I just don't think it belongs, if we're going to divide these 2 types of theology, I don't think it belongs on the Baptist principle side as much as it belongs on the Baptist prerequisite side. Now, I'll say, historically, it's commonly taught as a Baptist distinctive, but when it's taught that way, it's almost taught in that it's always taught in that misunderstood way, where what they're really talking about is soul liberty or soul competency. They don't mean priesthood of the believer. So in that sense, yes, it is a Baptist distinctive, but I just don't think that's the doctrine of the priesthood of all believers. I think that's a misunderstanding. So I've just put what most people mean by that phrase. I've put soul liberty, and if I were to put it on the chart, I'd make a new section called prerequisites of Protestantism, and I'd list priesthood of all believers on that side. But I do get what you mean. It certainly is consistent with and grounds our congregationalism.
Yeah, fair argument. Okay, well, cool. So I think that basically wraps up everything that we were wanting to get to, and all these resources. We're going to have the an extensive bibliography on this one. And then I don't know if you had any other books you wanted to mention that are going to be in there that you didn't have a chance to, or whatever.
I can't think of any right now, but every time I think, I've sent you every one that we should mention, I think of more later. So if I do think of another one,
we'll update the bibliography and I'll include the most up-to-date version of it that we have at the time of upload. But awesome. This has been an awesome conversation. It's something I've been thinking about for a while. I've had questions about and really kind of wrestled with and been like, I see some of the issues with the typical acronym that we use, and I like pieces of it. I don't like other pieces of it, but also I've not seen any other alternative perspective. And so I've been wrestling with that and trying to figure out. And so this came along at a really good time. And it's been a very beneficial and educational conversation. I think it's super helpful.
Likewise. And thank you so much for letting me come on. And I learn as we sit here and chat back and forth, and I enjoy it. I never thought we would talk for 2 or 3 hours about Baptist identity. But when we mentioned the other day, maybe before we talk about, Baptist history and stuff, we should just talk about identity. I thought, we'll have a 30-minute, hour-long conversation, but there's just so much there that we could talk about. It just turns into a much longer conversation.
It's the same case as like when we, the very first conversation that we had. I feel like every time we get together and talk, we spend 4 hours talking about theology and church history and things like that. And then it's like, oh my goodness, where did the time go?
Right.
So I've enjoyed it. It's been super helpful. And I think other people will benefit from it as well if they decide to sit through the whole thing.
Feel free to fast forward me if I get too long-winded. But I'm honored that you let me come on. I enjoy the conversation very much. I'm grateful to be here.
Awesome. Well, thanks for joining me. I appreciate it. With that, that's all we have for today. So I'm going to end it there. Everybody else, have a great day, and we'll see you later.